Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. It is Thursday, April 7th. I'm Brian Driscoll. That's Ryan Roberts. You know who we are. Let's get rocking and rolling, Ryan. Today, we're going to talk about Notre Dame recruiting, and we're going to talk about Notre Dame's 2023 recruiting class. And we're going to talk about whether or not Notre Dame's 2023 recruiting class can be there's two ways of looking at it, Ryan. One is the number one ranked class from a perception standpoint. More importantly, can it be that kind of class that closes the gap? Like really, like not just that, like, get you closer, but can it be that Notre Dame, here's the premise that Ryan and I have. This class, if things go right, has a chance to be that class that, with what they've done the last 2 years, to not just gets Notre Dame closer, but just closes the gap. And it can be that kind of class. It's going to be hard to do, but it's possible. And I don't know if I've ever felt that Notre Dame could do that with one class this quickly. Again, when looking in context of the two previous classes along with it, right? And so what needs to happen? And so as we've kind of talked about this, and I wrote an article similar about this a couple weeks ago at Irish Breakdown. But Ryan, as we talk about it, the month of April is so important for Notre Dame. I mean, if they don't have success in this month, big success in this month, they're still going to get a gap closing class, but it's going to be a traditional gap closing class where, you know what, you did well. It's a top 5 to 7 class and you did better and your roster's even better. Or the difference between that or, yeah, this class is that. It's that class. It's that program changing class. And I really don't think they can just have an okay month of April and ultimately get that off, because we're now, 8 months away from signing day, right? Like it's so much quicker now, right? And kids make decisions so much quicker now. And so this next, 25 to 30 days, kind of through April into early May, because early May meaning kids may commit in May, but it's based on their visit and things that have happened in April. This next month, Ryan, it ultimately is going to define whether or not Notre Dame can have that type of program-changing 2023 class.
I agree completely. I think that we talk a lot about the players that are on the cusp of commitment, and you obviously made a post about that the other day as far as like what the over-under is on how many guys could commit into the class. But also I think it's this is a big momentum builder on some players as well, right? Because for a while, it's got a lot the gap has gotten closed now, but for a while there, Cardinal Tate was looked at as probably a little bit of a dream scenario, right? Like he wasn't a guy that maybe was on the cusp of being really feeling comfortable about his chances with Notre Dame. But if you're leaving summer feeling good about where that is with the momentum moving forward, Jaden Ausberry was a guy that we did not think Notre Dame was going to be in great position with, and it seems like they are in a much better position than we originally anticipated. So you have to use the momentum not only the players that you're going to commit this month, but also moving forward, because there's going to be some players, some recruits, and it's completely up to them. It's their individual choice here. Some are very I want to let the process play out. I want to take all my officials and I want to make a decision a little further down the road, and that's totally fine. But Notre Dame needs to leave summer being one of those teams that makes a big impact, obviously, on those recruiting trails, both on the committed players that will be in the class soon and the ones that they're in a better position of maybe we originally anticipated, but are going to take longer in their decision-making process. Brian, you're on mute.
We're going to go through this list and we're going to talk about committed players and uncommitted players and upsets and summer positioning is one of the things we're going to talk about. And to your point, you talk about Cardinal Tate and Jaden Ausberry and there's other guys, but the reality is if you don't have success in April with the visits that are coming up with these kids, then you're not going to be in position to get them in the summer. And it all ties into why this next month is going to be that month for Notre Dame and why it's important that they have success. And so I think the first thing to start off with, Ryan, is part of the reason that we think Notre Dame can have this kind of class is because of where they stand right now. They're the number 1 ranked class and it's not really close. You talk about the 9 kids that are committed. They're all 4-star recruits. I think 8 of them are ranked in their rivals and actually I think all 9 of them are ranked in their rivals 250. I believe still. At least 8 of them. you look at, I think 5 or 6 of them are ranked as top 100 players by at least one service, right? Like you've got Keon Keeley is, Brendan Vernon is, Drake Bowen is, Justin Redd is, and Peyton Bowen is. It's not 6 anymore. It used to be 6 because Cooper Flanagan was 99 on the 247 sports rankings, but he's now down to, I believe, 108, right? So he's just outside, right? Something like that. So the foundation is so important. Part of the very first part of this success in April is you've got 2 of the kids. There's 3 kids that are taking visits from this group that we know of. There's just 3. And that would be taking visits to other programs. Obviously, Keon Keeley, Peyton Bowen, and Justin Redd. We have varying levels of degree of confidence with each of those players, Ryan. But anytime a kid is taking visits, no matter how confident you are, there's always a concern that he's going to go somewhere, just be blown away. So there's always concern there. Notre Dame is going to get, as of right now, we have confirmed with 2 of the 3 that they will be on campus for the Blue Gold game. I'm not sure about Justin Rett. I'm not saying he isn't. I just don't remember seeing his name. Is he going to be up in town for the Blue Gold game?
Yeah, Ryan, I believe so. I believe the only
list now.
I believe the only commit that will not be at the Blue and Gold game that has been verified is Cooper Flanagan. Yep.
Okay. So we have it down there. Justin Rett is on our list. So you're going to have all 3 of those kids on campus for the Blue Gold game. We have confirmed with both Keon and Peyton that they will also be there. And it's going to be very, very important for Notre Dame for at least 2 of those guys to get very firm, I don't say recommitments, but look, if Keon Keeley still wants to take official visits, you say, okay, take official visits. I mean, you don't love it. You're not happy about it. But the thing that they need to understand is, guys, if you really are, like, I understand if you aren't sure if Notre Dame's the place for you, you have to make sure that it's the right place for you. Because I've always believed, Ryan, that if kids don't do what it takes to feel sure that the decision they make is the right one, it's much easier, or it's much harder to then deal with the adversity that comes down the road when something doesn't go their way, right? I'm saying this as someone who made the wrong decision in college. I went to a college for the wrong reasons and never was comfortable with it, and just did. I mean, I started as a freshman, but just things didn't go and I transferred, right? So this isn't a place of criticism. It's just advice as a player, as a coach. When kids make decisions like this and they're not sure that this is the right decision and they just end it because they don't want to go back on their word or whatever, then what tends to happen is they end up flipping real late in the process, or they leave early in their careers. And so it's not just about getting them to recommit. It's about getting them to be convinced that, yeah, this is the place for you. Because if those guys are still taking visits, it's a harder sell for the staff to other players. If, for example, Keon Keeley or Peyton Bowen or Justin Rett came out of the Blue Gold game in April saying, hey, you know what, man, I remember now why I picked Notre Dame. This is the place for me. I'm done. I'm not taking officials. I'm taking one official visit. That's to Notre Dame. That is something that the staff can really use to sell to other recruits, because right now, you can't sell Keon being in your class or Peyton Bowen being in your class as well as you could, because they're still taking visits. And, you try to sell that to a kid that's looking at Alabama, Bama's going to be like, that kid's been on our campus like 2 times already. You know what I mean? Like Ohio State can be like, hey, we had that kid on our campus recently. Now, whether or not they actually have a shot at him is a different conversation. And you and I have always felt confident that Keon's going to end up at Notre Dame. We've always felt good about that. He's just too good of a fit at Notre Dame not to end up at Notre Dame. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to be an effective recruiting ploy for those schools with other players. If they come out of those visits saying, hey, this is it for me, I'm done, Notre Dame's place for me, now I'm going to do what I need to do to get the best players with me, that's going to be huge. So step number 1, priority number 1 for the Notre Dame staff is as best as they can getting the committed players to remind everyone that they are committed players.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously the overarching allure of Notre Dame is not just the football team, right? It is the entire culture. It's the entire campus. It's what it can do for you long-term. But the one layer that we haven't talked about much is the fact that when all three of these players committed, there was a different head coach, right? And that's it. I mean, that's a different conversation. The practice is going to be run a little different. What you've seen of the program in the past is just going to be a little bit different. There's going to be a different feel to it. Now, the positive to these three players is that they're all defensive players, and they all are there for a large degree because of Marcus Freeman, right? That is a what has been consistent throughout this transition period is the fact that the guy that they were really clinging to and the guy that really was able to sell them the vision of the defense is still on campus and is now running things even to a higher level. So I feel pretty good about where they are. And I know we talk about varying levels of degree. I have not wavered from Keon Keeley. I feel like he's in a good spot. Justin Rhett, I've not wavered at all. And then obviously Peyton Bowen's one that we need to talk a little bit more about. But I really do think that the fact that Marcus Freeman is the person that got the head coaching job, I feel like that's going to go a long way to really selling these kids here in the spring that this is the right spot for them.
I tried to see, this is how the professional Ryan is, folks. I tried to get him to laugh in the middle of his commentary with this comment from Fatfish, and I couldn't do it. So Ryan's professionalism grows by leaps and bounds on a daily basis. So I appreciate that.
Is that what we're going to do? We're going to try to make each other laugh?
No, I'm allowed to do that. You're not
okay.
allowed to do that because I will fail. I'm just going to tell you right now. I agree. I agree with you that we especially Justin Rhett. I'm not concerned at all. I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm not concerned about Keon because I do think when he visits these campuses, he gives those schools an honest chance to make their pitch. It's not like Dante Moore visiting Ohio State this past weekend. I just think he's going there thinking like you're going to have to convince me of something really big because he really does love Notre Dame. And I think that was only solidified when he visited in March. I think that helped because, when you're as far away as a kid like Keon is, you can't just come back every other weekend like Drake Bowen can, right? Or, if Brennan Vernon wants to come to practice, it's like a 4.5-hour drive. It's something he can do more often than Keon can come from Tampa, Florida, right? So I think those things help. But yeah, I've always felt comfortable with it. But again, it's not so much about this isn't so much about the point I'm making, right? It's so much about whether or not I think Keon's going to be in the class. I think that he is. It's more of the longer he remains sort of still looking, it makes it harder for Notre Dame and Marcus Freeman and all that to be able to convince those other prospects like, hey, look, man, you're going to be playing behind this cat. Hey, Jason Moore, Devin Houston, you're going to be playing with Keon Keeley. You're going to be playing with Brennan Vernon. Well, the Brennan Vernon part's solid. The Drake Bowen part is solid, right? It's the Justin Rhett part, I think, is solid. But with, right now, arguably your two highest ranked players in the class are Peyton Bowen and Keon Keeley. Now, I think part of that is because of the fact that they're still looking around, if we're going to be honest,
Sure.
In Keon's case. But I think other players have dropped because they're not looking around. If Drake Bowen was still taking visits right now, he wouldn't be dropping the way that he is. I mean, there's just no doubt in my mind. But it is what it is. So I think those are important. Those are keys number one in this whole process is if you can come out of April with those guys saying, hey, we're locked in, then I think that helps. And then, of course, Ryan, when we look at the number two thing, it's Dante Moore. We had a little nugget on the message board about Dante. Look, I don't think this can happen without Dante Moore because with all due respect to other quarterbacks on the board, they're good players. They're not Dante Moore. From a talent standpoint or from a perception standpoint. And both of those matter in recruiting. I mean, whether we like, it's like Tate Martell committing to Ohio State had an impact on Ohio State's recruiting. Now, you and I'm sure, I didn't know you then, but I guarantee you that we probably had the same opinion on Tate Martell as a quarterback. No, that kid's not even a top 200 player, much less a 5-star. But to recruits, it's Tate Martell from Bishop Gorman, and he's ranked a 5-star and all this other kind of stuff. And it matters. So perception does matter, but practically speaking, forget the perception part of it, which is important. Dante Moore isn't Tate Martell. Dante Moore's a phenomenal talent. And so I don't think you can have a great top 5 to 7 class without Dante Moore. You can't have a program changing class without Dante Moore. And so getting him to commit and make it known in the month of April, to me, is ultimately we could have done this number one. It's the number one thing from an important standpoint. It's number two from just a line of putting a good show together, right? You focus on the committed kids first. But practically speaking, they're not going to have the tidal wave on offense that they could have without Dante Moore committing. I believe that, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that Dante Moore committing. So, I mean, like, let's phrase it like this for a second, right? You talked about the three guys that that Notre Dame needs to close on, or not close on per se, to resell the vision, right? We're talking about a defensive end out of the state of Florida. We're talking about a safety out of the state of Texas. And we're talking about a quarterback out of the state of Nevada, Bishop Gorman, one of the better, almost said colleges, one of the better high schools in high school football. Those three are, I don't want to call them rarities, Brian, because Notre Dame recruits nationally, but getting those three regions right there is a huge start to the class. You want to talk, I mean, usually we're talking a little bit more about, well, Notre Dame might get an early Midwest commits. They might get a guy that's, relatively close, a Northeast, North, maybe something a little closer to Notre Dame. That fact that they're tapping into those regions early is big, because we've talked a lot this offseason about how important it is for Notre Dame to get into Texas this year. And you pull, the best defensive back out of Texas, right? Like one of the best safeties in all of high school football out of the state of Texas. So the reason that I feel confident that Notre Dame can contend for number one class, let's be honest about it. It's because there's a 5-star quarterback that's on the board and he's 2.5 hours away. This is a rarity. This doesn't happen every single year.
Let's talk about the guy you just talked about, Ryan, Peyton Bowen.
Yeah.
One of the big draws to Oklahoma right now is Jackson Arnold, his high school teammate. Now, the reality is that that's always going to be a pull to Oklahoma, but it's an easier sell for Notre Dame when you're like, hey, look, we love Jackson. We like Jackson a lot too. We recruited Jackson, but look, man, this is the deal here. It's just another feather in your cap, even for a kid like Jackson Arnold, Peyton Bowen, who has a top 100 quarterback on his high school team. That is part of the reason he's looking at Oklahoma. I mean, so even for a kid like that, like, I think to your point, Dante Moore it's a needle mover for kids. It doesn't mean it's ultimately going to make every single kid pick Notre Dame. It's not. They're going to miss on kids they want. But man, it's a big time needle moving commitment. And especially for a kid who is already committed, Ryan, it can be that thing that says, you know what, especially if Dante does it before the blue gold game, then Peyton visits later. And, if Dante's able to be there. Right. So reason I interrupted you, for a kid like that, I think that landing a kid like Dante Moore is paramount to saying, yeah, Notre Dame is the place.
Yeah. I mean, it's just generally how quarterbacks work, right? Because you don't have a class as good as we have this year every single year, but there's a couple guys in this class that are needle movers. Like Malachi Nelson's a guy that can come into play with Malachi Nelson. Arch Manning, although we talk about like maybe he's a little overrated from a recruiting ranking perspective, he's a big name. People are going to want to come to play with Arch Manning. Like, there's no doubt about it. And people are going to want to come to play with Dante Moore. And in the case of Peyton Bowen, his quarterback right now, Jackson Arnold, might not be going to Notre Dame, but he might have a second glance and be like, oh, but that guy's really good too. Like, he's no slouch. You know what I mean? Right. So yes, I think quarterback is the gatekeeper for a reason. They are the key to a class every single year. You get a great one in the fold and things just kind of seem to fall into place. To your point with Tate Martell, the perception was higher than the actual product of Tate Martell, but the fact that he was a name and the perception was out there, it leads to a great class. It's just how it works.
And I'm actually pulling up his stuff now because I believe that Ohio State had that 2017 class was pretty loaded, if I remember correctly. Yeah, finished number 2 that year in the class. But here's the other guys they got on offense in that class. J.K. Dobbins, it's pretty good. Trayvon Grimes, Josh Myers, Wyatt Davis, Thayer Munford. I'd say that's pretty good group of offensive players, right? But I think too, it's not just about Dante alone. Like, Dante alone isn't going to cause 15 different guys to pick Notre Dame. But what it does is there may be, 2 or 3 guys that immediately you're like, yep, okay, that's it. That's it for me. I'm going to Notre Dame because Dante is. Then that, Dante plus that kid, plus the other kid, plus the third kid. That's all of a sudden how that tidal wave starts, right? And that's kind of where it comes from. It's like, okay, man, y'all got Dante. Oh, man, y'all got Keon Keeley. Like, when was the last time Notre Dame had 2 top 10 players in the country? Here's your answer. It's never happened in the Rivals era. I went back and looked. They've never done it. Like, even years where they've gotten multiple top, like, 5-star players. So, like, 2013, they got multiple 5-star players. Only Jalen Smith was a top 10 guy. In 2011, they got multiple 5-star players. None of them were top 10. Aaron Lynch was the highest ranked guy. He was not a top 10 player. Ishaq Williams not a top 10 player. 2008, you got 3 5-star players. You've got Dane Christ, you got Michael Floyd, and you got Kyle Rudolph. None of them were top 10 players. And so you just Jimmy Clausen. So I mean, the number of top 10 national players they've gotten, and I'm talking the composite ranking. There's been guys that individually by one service, like Tommy Kramer was a top 10 player by 247. I'm talking about as a service, like as a composite. They've never had 2 top 10 players. They haven't had that many top 10 players, period. You had Manti in 09, you had Jimmy in 07, Jalen in 13. I think that's it. As far as just like top 10 players, I can't think of who else they had that was a top. Sam Young in 2000. I think Sam Young in 06 was. I'm actually going to look that up. I know that one service for sure had him as a top 10 player. I think one service even had him as the number 2 player in the country. I believe, Ryan. So I'm going to just look up what his national ranking is. But the moral of the story is he was 8th, so he was also top 10. The moral story is Notre Dame hasn't had that many top 10 players, period, much less 2 in the same class. That stuff matters. And so Keon's a top 10 player nationally. Dante's a top 10 player nationally. Now, whether or not they drop out 6 months from now because they committed to Notre Dame is irrelevant to the fact of the impact it will have now in the month of April. And that's the premise of this, is what they do with his ranking 6 months from now won't impact the impact that would have if he were to pick Notre Dame publicly now in April. And that's what makes it so important.
Yeah, no, it's the timing of everything. This is obviously, like you said, it's a big month. There's a lot of players that are on the cusp of making a commitment, it seems. And Dante Moore seems to be one of them. So it's absolutely a needle mover because I just think the timing of everything. And then going into the season, if Notre Dame's able to have a nice start to the season, they're able to, get a few nice wins, have a good product on the field, and that's where the momentum keeps building. So Dante Moore is the key to this class. And I know everyone wants to keep talking about him. And I, honestly, you kind of get a little tired of all the posts about it because we're going to share the updates as we can. But I mean,
right.
It's obviously worth talking about because he is such an important cog to the machine.
And that's where the patience needs to come on our end is like, look, we get why y'all are asking questions about that. We get that y'all are fired up about it. We get why. It's just like anything new on Dante. I want to be like, no, we know, but we have stuff, but we're just not going to tell you. Look, we've told you everything that if you remember the message board for sure, but even on here, you pretty much get you pretty much like. I mean, how long have we been saying, like, no matter what's being reported elsewhere, look, Notre Dame's in a good position with Dante Moore, right? I mean, even when it was, Michigan, and then it was Michigan State, then it was Miami. Like, okay, and nothing's changed. But it's just like, but until he goes public, it's going to be nerve-wracking for Notre Dame. And there's nothing behind my goes public comment in that instance. It's just making a statement that about, even if we said, hey, he's a silent commit, and I'm not saying that, but even if we did, there's still people like, well, if he's still taking visits, it doesn't matter. It's going to be about, when he finally makes that decision to say, hey, look, this is where I want to be, and I'm going to tell the world about it. It's going to send shockwaves through Notre Dame Nation, but it's going to send shockwave to the rest. And as you said, Ryan, he's the key to this being a number 1 class. Notre Dame is going to have an outstanding top 7 class, even without Dante Moore. It's good, but it's going to look a lot like last year's class. Really good, but not good enough to really close the gap on those other programs. It's just because at the end of the day, the reason Dante is such a big-time recruit is because fans recognize, just like the Notre Dame coaches do, that in today's era of college football, the Georgia 2021 teams are anomalies. they're rarities that you can't count on where you're able to win with a Stetson Bennett at quarterback. It's not the case, and it's not going to happen in Notre Dame, as we've seen. And so they understand that, look, a big-time quarterback like that is important, and I think that being able to land one like that 2 years after Tyler Buckner adds some thought of, well, now you've got, we talked a lot about margin for error in yesterday's show.
Yep.
I think that's part of it too, is like, well, if Tyler Buckner doesn't pan out, you've kind of got that next guy coming in next season. And I think there's that relief there. But if Tyler does pan out, then Dante becomes the continuation of that excellence. And I think that's what has Notre Dame fans excited. He's either going to start something great or continue something great if he picks Notre Dame. And that's just, I mean, that reason alone, Ryan, I understand, and I think fans are correct to be this hyped up about Dante Moore. It's not about undue hype on a player. It's about understanding how important quarterback is to success in college football today.
Mm-hmm. I think that, and Brian, if Notre Dame was going to catch a number one class, if they were going to claim one, I think this is the time to do it, because the optimism and the enthusiasm over Notre Dame football with Coach Freeman taking over this offseason is at an all-time high. I mean, people are legit so excited just to see what's going to happen next. And if Coach Freeman is able to start his full cycle and put a quality product in maybe the number one class in the country or top 2 to 3, whatever it ends up being, with a 5-star quarterback to the caliber of a Dante Moore, I mean, that's paramount, man. That is showing hey, I am here. We're playing with the big boys. I'm not here to just be a good program. I am here to take it to the next level. So the timing aspect that you talked about with when Dante would commit to Notre Dame if he chooses that. So I think timing goes all the way through the entire program. Yeah. The now to Coach Freeman's first year, because if you have a good momentum throughout the season, you sign the number one recruiting class, then it's go time, man. Yeah. We keep talking about when's the national championship going to come. Need to change things right now.
It's realistic now. No, that's a great point, Ryan. It's building on momentum, right? That's your point. Is the momentum's already started. That's why we say you're going to have a top 7 class. It's because of Marcus Freeman and the staff he's put together. You're going to have a top 7 class. I'm as confident that Notre Dame's going to have a 5 to 7 class as I've been in a long time without Dante Moore. But again, 5 to 7 doesn't necessarily get you there if it doesn't include an elite quarterback. That's the key. And so you're absolutely right. It's a good friend of mine in the recruiting world. We were talking about a week and a half ago, and he's like, Marcus Freeman's going to mess around and get the number one class in the country in his first year, isn't he? And I was like, he might. He said, Marcus Freeman may end up having the best recruiting class, Notre Dame's best recruiting class in the modern era. And the modern era in our terms is since the recruiting service has started, right? So was around 2002 in his first year, isn't he? And I was like, yeah, because that would be the number one class. I mean, they've had number 2s, they've had number 3s, right? So the only way to have the best ever is number 1. And, and again, quarterback is the key to that. Because let's be honest. I mean, the number 2 ranked class in Notre Dame had the best class they ever had in the Rivals era from a ranking standpoint was number 2. They had a 5-star quarterback in that class. Now he ended up not panning out, but you had a 5-star quarterback in Dane Christ in that class. And, Dane had an impact. Getting Dane Christ had an impact. It made it easier to keep Michael Floyd in the class and get Deion Walker and Kyle Rudolph. And, I think Jonas Gray was part of that class too in 2008. So it certainly matters. But it can't just be Dante Moore. This April also has to be about closing on some other top players that you're in a good position with. And to me, Braylon James is to me at the top of that list, because I think if it's going to go one of two ways. Either Dante commits soon, which then leads to, maybe Braylon making that decision. And then that's the moment. It could be maybe Dante goes first if Dante picks Notre Dame and decides to make a decision in April. He goes first. And then, let's say Braylon makes the same decision. And then now that's the momentum. That's the key. It's that second one is the key. Or it could be Braylon makes a decision first, and he's going to make his announcement for wherever he's going to go on the 19th of April. And then Dante follows suit. And then all of a sudden the momentum goes, right? So it's going to be one or the other, but I think Braylon James is a must get for Notre Dame And I'm glad that he has announced, because there was talk that he was contemplating waiting until the summer to announce a decision, which would give him time to, be certain about whatever his decision is. He has decided that he wants to do it now. And we're 12 days away from that. And, we think Notre Dame's in a great place. And that's as far as we're willing to go with that conversation. But he would be another guy that you're talking about, another top 100 player, Ryan, that would continue that momentum. And it's not just, and this is to the point we'll circle back to something you said earlier. It's not just that Braylon James is a highly ranked player. It's not just that he's a talented player. He's a skill player from Texas that Texas and Texas A&M wanted desperately. So it's not just that he's a good player. There's that momentum of, hey, Peyton, you're not coming up here alone, buddy. You know what I mean? And I think that also adds to that notion of this is why a guy like Braylon James would be such an important pickup for Notre Dame. There's the practical reason, which is always the most important. He's a really good player. That's a great fit for the Notre Dame offense. He's also a great fit for Notre Dame, period, Ryan, because he's a phenomenal student. He's thoughtful. He's worldly in all the positive ways I could mean that, right? I mean, how often do you meet a 16, 17-year-old kid that's like, I want to go out of state because I want to experience more of the world? You don't hear that much from young people. It just says a lot about who Braylon is and how he was raised, right? I mean, it's like kids like that go to Notre Dame. And that's why I think we felt good about where Notre Dame stood for a while, but you've got to seal the deal. And that would be part of that really big momentum aspects of this.
Yeah, I mean, Braylon's a great fit as a person, obviously. It's also a great fit because if there's a question that gets asked behind the Dante Moore question, it's wide receiver recruiting. Like, that is one of the biggest one, because we know that the numbers and just the continuation of putting talented players into the receiving room is paramount for this team moving forward. So not only are you getting a top 100 wide receiver, you're also touching the state of Texas, which we keep talking about it being such a big moment. And I'll be honest, Brian, like, I had somebody, buddy that follows recruiting closely, it was like, there's no way Braylon James is going to leave the state of Texas to go up to South Bend, Indiana. I'm like, well, we'll see, man. He likes him a lot. It could happen. There's a possibility there. So I think, again, tapping into the important states that Notre Dame needs to touch, the Texas, the Floridas. We talk about California, how important that is, keeping the Midwest kids in South Bend. Getting a top 100 wide receiver out of the state of Texas in this class, it's undeniably important.
It would be huge.
Yeah,
it would be huge. And it's also, again, there's different layers to any recruitment and commitment. And should they get Braylon James, it's the momentum, it's Texas, it's all those kind of things. But this is when we talk about, like, one builds on another. It's never just like they got this one guy, so the next 13 guys all came because of that guy. It's not really how it works alone. It's impactful, but they got that guy, which led to 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 that, right? And so we've talked about Cardinal Tate a lot and how important he is to this class. And the thing about Cardinal Tate is, and talking to Sean, because there's nobody more cued in on Cardinal Tate's recruitment in the media than Sean Davis, who's a recruiting analyst at Irish Breakdown. I mean, nobody. And you talk to Sean, and Cardinal's thing is he's a smart kid. Cardinal's a really smart kid. And if you listen to the interview with Sean, you get that he's a real thoughtful kid. And Cardinal understands two things very clearly among many other important aspects to recruiting. Number one is, if I'm going to be a great player and win a championship, I need a great guy throwing me the football, right? I mean, that's duh. And then the other one is I can't be the only weapon, right? And so Cardinal, talking to Sean and his conversation with Cardinal, is Notre Dame landing other big-time receivers is actually going to be a benefit, because we've had people ask us, like, if they get Braylon James early, is that going to hurt with Cardinal Tate? And the answer is the exact opposite. It helps because he can now look and say, okay, they got Tobias Merriweather last year. If they get Braylon James, they got Braylon James. They're going to have dudes at tight end. Like, okay, yeah, if I were to go to Notre Dame, they can't just double team me all game because I'm it, right? And so Cardinal gets that. And it's not that it's, again, none of these things are, okay, this happens and that means this. But it's just another one of those feathers in Notre Dame's cap to where when you talk about the momentum building towards a number one class, to me, Braylon James isn't getting enough conversation as being a part of that. Because it would be either a momentum starter or a momentum builder. But either way, depending on the timing of other people. But either way, I think Braylon James would be a big, big part of this practically and from a perception standpoint. And those are the two things that matter, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Notre Dame needs numbers in this wide receiver group so they need multiple guys. This isn't just the Cardinal Tate, and then you can sign whoever else, off the street. Like, you need some dudes all the way across the board. And I think everyone can agree when you watch Braylon James's tape, if you have already, kid is a very talented player. He's explosive. He's got a frame where I think he's going to be 6'2", 6'3", and 205, 210 pounds when everything is said and done. And he's a very explosive kid. There's a high upside to a Braylon James. So it's not just about Cardinal Tate and then see who else we can get. That's not the end all be all for Notre Dame. Notre Dame needs to put a 3 to 4, maybe 5-man wide receiver class across the board, pushing it if we have some versatility there. But Notre Dame needs numbers in this cycle, and they need dudes. There's no doubt about it.
So I'm trying to see if I got the okay from somebody to publish his numbers from a camp he was at this summer that had electronic testing. Braylon James did. I'm not sure if I'm able to post those numbers or not, so I just put a message in. But needless to say, Ryan, when we make those public, you're going to be like, oh, okay. Yep. I get it. That guy's explosive. Yeah. And so, I mean, he's a guy, and he's an important one. And another important one is another local guy. And this is part of the reason that you talk about the musts for Notre Dame. Big, not necessarily for April, but just big picture. But we've talked about how good of a year this is in the North, in the Northeast. Notre Dame has to tap into that in a big, big way. And one of the guys as part of that is Charles Jagasaw. He's going to be on campus this weekend. I believe he's going to be at Notre Dame on Saturday and Michigan on Sunday. Correct, Ryan? Is that the order, or is it the other way around? I always forget. He's going to be at Notre Dame and Michigan this weekend.
I think it's Notre Dame then Michigan.
Notre Dame's in a great place there. I mean, but again, it's about closing. Anytime you're the school to beat for a kid, and Notre Dame is the school to beat, anytime that's true, the longer the recruitment goes on, the more you worry, right? Because it's like, if we're the school, what's he waiting on? And I think that's the nervousness that a lot of people have. It's almost like our confidence in Dante has created additional angst with Notre Dame fans, because it's like, well, if that's true, then why is he not committing? And I think the same thing is true if Charles Jagasaw doesn't pop in April. If he doesn't make a decision in April or early May, then I think it's going to be I'll get nervous personally, to be honest with you. And I think closing on him in April is important because, number one, practically he's a big time player, and number two, he's a regional kid. And then number three, you need to kick off the offensive line class, because the offensive line class is going to be important. And it could be as few as 3 guys. I mean, honestly, if they got the right 3-man class, I'm okay with that. They just signed 5 last year, 5 the year before. I can live with a 3-man class if it's a Jagasaw, Freeling type of 3-man class, right? And they choose to go, numbers elsewhere. I think 4 is still the number that they want. But you've got to get that momentum started at some point, and what better way to do it than with a top 100 player on the board? I mean, that again, who's in your backyard, basically. I mean, Illinois needs to be Notre Dame territory, unless a kid's from like East St. Louis or that part that's like that's real far away. That's not really but if a kid's from Illinois, for the most part, 9 times out of 10, that's got to be treated like a Notre Dame backyard kid, and they've got to get those guys if they want them, and they definitely want Charles Jagasaw.
Yeah, and he's an high academic kid, obviously, for the interest here. And, I mean, right now, Brian, we talked a little bit about this the other day about why Notre Dame needs to tap into Missouri a little bit more, like the St. Louis area specifically. I mean, Illinois, the top school in the state is University of Illinois. They obviously can't recruit with you if you're Notre Dame, if you want a kid there. And Jagasaw's top other school outside of Notre Dame, it's perceived that it is the University of Iowa, right? So, although Iowa has done a good job of developing offensive linemen, Notre Dame should not be losing battles one-on-one against Iowa for a offensive lineman if they want him. So Jagasaw is a very important player in this class, because I agree. I don't think that the numbers, I think the quality is more important than maybe just the quantity in this class, but I would still like Notre Dame personally also to get to 4 if they can. But I mean, Jagasaw's upside is about as high as any offensive lineman in this class nationally, like not just on Notre Dame's board. This kid is a legit 6'6" with length, 300 plus pounds, wrestler, all state wrestler, has very good hands, and he has quick feet. Technically, he needs to get obviously more refined when he really focuses on football. But this kid could be, you could tell me he's a starting offensive tackle in the future if he lands at Notre Dame. You could tell me that he's one of the most dominant guards in college football as well. I think the upside is just substantial with a guy like Charles Jagasaw.
I want to go back to Braylon James. I just got the okay. So Ryan, this was his numbers from an event where it was electronically tested times. This is from a combine that he competed in. So he's 6'2", he's a little over 6'2", 182. He had a 77.25-inch wingspan,
which is massive.
Massive. Yep. 4.47 in the 40-yard dash.
It's faster than I thought, to be honest. That's nice. Yeah.
4.27 in the shuttle.
Solid.
38.5-inch vertical.
It's decent.
And a 130 broad jump.
A 10-10 broad as a 16 or 17-year-old.
Junior in high school.
Yeah. That's pretty good.
130-inch broad jump. So, yeah.
To put that into perspective for a second, folks, I know we've been talking a lot about NFL draft recently. Obviously, we're only a couple weeks away from the 2022 event kicking off. Those numbers would rival some of the best in this class as guys going into the professional ranks. Yeah. That is silly. And
these are electronic times. Those were electronic times.
They're legit.
40-yard dash. Yeah.
Right.
So this isn't like, yeah. So, I mean, again, and that's the thing that I've always said is this kid's got speed that people don't realize he has yet. Because as a receivers coach, I can look at that and say his technique keeps him from being as fast as he's going to be. And that's a discussion you and I have had. I'm like, look, when he gets coached up without the strength program, just that coaching alone is going to make this kid faster. And that's part of the evaluation for a college receivers coach is looking at that, like, and being able to evaluate that. So those are really impressive numbers for a 6'2", 180-plus pound kid that's 16, 17 years old. I mean, those are really good numbers. And for context, Jaden Lamar was at a camp out west that had electronically timed 40, and he had the fastest 40 time at the event with a 4.53 is what I read. So Braden James is 4.47. Okay. And this isn't someone telling me that. This is someone taking a screenshot of his results and sending it to me. Right. And so, again, yes, the ranking is important, top 100 and all that. But at the end of the day, Braylon James is a really good football player that Texas wants bad.
Yeah.
So
and he's in their backyard. And
yes.
He's in their backyard. Yeah.
Yes, he's not far from there. So that would be a big one. And it also would show, to your point, Ryan, as we kind of jump back to him, because I was able to get that. Being able to go to Texas for a kid that you weren't really leading on previously says a lot about Chancey Stuckey's, the relationship he built to begin with. But it also goes to show there's a lot more players like Braylon James out there that people don't realize. Why was Notre Dame not a player for him beforehand? Right? Because in every like, he is the kid they always say isn't out there. Right? It's like it's like Marvin Mims. Marvin Mims, we got asked a question the other day, and it's hard for me to say this. And I try to refrain from answering this question, but it's like going back over 6 or 7 years, who are the guys you think Notre Dame would have landed if Marcus Freeman was the head coach? And I'm like, well, that's hard to say. That's one that I feel like if this current, not in the Marcus Freeman, if this current staff was here 5, 6 years, and it's hard to say, but the one that I would say for sure is a guy like Marvin Mims, Ryan. I mean, you're talking about a kid that was committed to Stanford at one point in time. So clearly the academic piece is there. And so this is another example of that. A kid from Texas that's academically oriented, that if you do what you're supposed to do as a coaching staff, you're going to get. But the previous coaching staff probably wouldn't have tried to get on him until the summer. And by that point in time, he's like, well, dude, I'm already committed to Stanford, or I'm already committed to Texas, or Ohio State or LSU or something, right? And that's, again, that's an example of, he is an example of why this staff is different. Because when this staff got hired and I saw that they, talking about going after Braylon James, I was like, I don't get Braylon James. You know what I mean? Like, you don't go to Texas and get those kind of kids. And this is coming from someone who thinks that this staff was pretty, that Marcus Freeman could do some pretty impressive things and has been advocating for how good of a job Tommy Rees has done for a year. And I'm like, not going to happen. Right. And the fact that it's got a chance of happening just says a lot about the staff. You got him, you got Jagasol. If you're able to get Dante Moore, Braylon James, and Charles Jagasol in April, right, that's 3 top 100 recruits on offense. This whole conversation about, is offense going to catch up to the defense? That's gone if you get those 3 kids. And that is to me the foundation. The reason we talk about them, that's the foundation of the snowball effect that we think needs to happen. Not just can happen, but needs to happen if Notre Dame's going to have a number 1 ranked recruiting class. I wholeheartedly believe that they're that important to this whole thing happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, you said it loud and clear again. You look at the positions that are in the, and I mean, again, and also we didn't even mention this, and I know we've talked about this before. 9 commitments in the class right now. 7 of 9 are on the defensive side of the football, and we're just talking about a couple offensive players, obviously with Charles Jagasol, offensive lineman, and wide receiver Braylon James. So Notre Dame does need to get the offensive side of recruiting kicked off a little bit this month. Like, that is another thing that is paramount in this class. And I mean, if that just tells you the caliber, because I mean, Brian, like we talked about the importance of Texas. We keep talking about that. But the previous 5 years, Notre Dame has only signed 3 players from the state of Texas in the previous 5 recruiting classes, right? They now have a legitimate chance, if they're able to sign Braylon James, to have 2 early on in this process. So who knows how everything shakes out. So, I mean, again, it's a big point of emphasis, I believe, and obviously there is a connection with Chancey Stuckey being at Baylor. Like he's obviously very familiar with a lot of some of these Texas players that are coming up through the ranks. But I really think that it's also a point of change in the recruiting dynamics where, like, why are we not going into Texas? Why are we backing down from these Texas schools to keep them in state? Why are we not going, XYZ? Like, why are we not touching these different sections that we haven't touched as much recently? And I think that that's just the ability to understand that we need to compete and we can compete.
Right. One of the things that we'll talk about in the show here as well, Ryan, and is to have a class like that, you got to pull off some upsets, right? Well, the reality is things like this lead to upsets. And here's an example. What we talked about, if Peyton Bowen just says, you know what, man, forget it. I'm all Notre Dame, man. I've enjoyed taking visits, but I'm all Notre Dame. And then let's just say they are able to get Braylon James in April. Now, all of a sudden, when Darren Gillette visits, another star from Texas, when he visits, because that kid's upside is as high as any linebacker on the board for Notre Dame. I mean, he's still raw, and there's a little bit more boom or bust with him, but the boom potential is enormous with that kid. But now, all of a sudden, there's 2 other kids from Texas in the class. He's another kid that's into the academic aspect of things. Those type of things get made easier when you keep adding on to and adding on to and adding on to. And that's the whole point, Ryan, is you want to get more kids from Texas, sign more kids from Texas, and then it makes it easier to get the next group of kids from Texas. It's always that first batch that can be the hardest, right? And so that's why it's important. And you're getting them on both sides of the ball, potentially. All those things just kind of factor into it. And, and then there's another guy, Ryan, that's really an intriguing player that I think could be part of an April momentum swing. And that is, look, Notre Dame wants a second back in this class. And the guy they've zeroed in on is Jaden Lamar. That's the guy they want as the number 2 back in this class. Not number 2 as in like he's the second back in a ranking order. He's the second back from a number standpoint. They already have one. And he would be the guy, in my view, that they would actually rank at the top. I mean, he'd be their best running back in the class. And that's Jaden Lamar. And it's kind of interesting because a month ago you're talking to him and it's like, I'm not sure. I'm going to visit Notre Dame and they're going to be my top group, but I'm not sure when. I definitely know I'm going here and here, but I'm not sure when I'm going to Notre Dame. To now, when we enter the month of April, you're like, boy, Notre Dame could be tough to beat for this kid now, especially if things really go well when he visits in April. And now he's been on campus before, but
Mm-hmm.
If things go well on April 23rd, then, hey, you know what? This could be a deal. So again, it just adds to just another big, important piece, because now you're talking about a 4-star running back, a top 250 kid. It just adds to just that ranking, to where the point you made early is, it's just from a pure ranking standpoint, this month could lead to Notre Dame being so far ahead they'd almost have to not get anybody worth a darn the rest of the way to not be number one at that point in time.
And I don't know if this matters too much, Brian, but you can correct me if I'm wrong here, because obviously you've been doing this a lot longer than I have. I felt like for a few years there, and this was obviously before I started covering recruiting, I felt like the University of Washington kind of was a kind of thorn in the
Big
side,
time pain in their butt.
And getting a kid out of the state of Washington back-to-back years, I mean, that's a nice little push, I think, at least like a little sign, like, like we're not, because what was it? It was Kyler Gordon was one, right? Where they missed out on.
It was him. They wanted Jalen. Oh, I'm forgetting Jalen McDaniel. What's the receiver's name? Jalen McMillan.
Yeah.
Big time. Chip Long wanted him bad. It was Asa Turner, who was a California kid that they beat Notre Dame for. I mean, it wasn't just Washington kids. Kyler Gordon was a Washington kid, but they were beating Notre Dame for West Coast kids, period.
Right.
I mean, the only Washington guy the only guy Washington, I think I remember Notre Dame beating Washington for, of a kid that actually liked Washington, because Isaiah Foskey looked at Washington, but they weren't a real serious contender, was Jordan Botelho. That's the only one that I can really remember Washington being much of a player where Notre Dame actually won the battle in recent years. And you can go back to Kavari Russell in 2012, but they were the exceptions, not the rule. Imagine what Notre Dame's defense would have been like this if Kyler Gordon was playing opposite of Cam Hart, because Mike Elko wanted Kyler Gordon big time. Well, not only did you beat them for Tobias Merriweather, who's a dude, but you beat them for Benjamin Morrison, who was a top corner on their board. You beat Jimmy Lake for Benjamin Morrison. And so Notre Dame has done what you're supposed to do when a program that's been kicking your butt is struggling. You beat them. You take advantage of them being down, and they've done that. And this is another opportunity. And it's interesting. It's he didn't even have Washington in his final 9, which is really bizarre. But here's the thing I'll say, though, Ryan. I really like their head coach. And the problem that he has is he's not a name. And so until he wins, you're going to be able to have some success against him. Now, I think once he wins, then I think that they're going to be a little bit tougher, especially for offensive players. I don't know what you think about him, but when you look at what he did at Indiana, I'm talking about Kalen DeBoer, for those who don't know, what he did at Indiana as the OC, what he did at Fresno this past season was really impressive. He got Michael Penix transferred there to play for him at Washington this year. They're gonna get turned around quickly. So the goal is to get enough wins in the meantime that you still have that, you have a Tobias, you have a Jay Lamar on campus, to where you've got a better shot at beating them when they become tough again. That's important too. And it's a bit of a side thing. It doesn't have anything to do with the number 1 class, but it does have an impact. So if you're able to get a kid like him, and to your point, get 2 big-time offensive players out of the state of Washington in back-to-back years, that's going to help you in future years, because Washington doesn't produce a lot of great players, but it consistently produces a good amount of players. And for whatever reason, kids from Washington have been willing to leave the state. It just hasn't been often for Notre Dame. Ohio State got 2 big-time receivers from Washington in recent years, right? And so if Notre Dame can start having success there, that's a state that's going to out west is going to produce some really good players that have shown a willingness to leave if it's the right situation in the past. And so that's just another reason why Jaden Lamar becomes a really important player for Notre Dame in so many different ways.
Well, it's creating a pipeline. I mean, it really is, because you mentioned Texas and getting into Texas. It's not just about Texas for this year. It's about the next year, the year after that. I mean, the one cool thing that I like that Notre Dame's done is I like the graphic that was floating out there with the St. Louis kids, right? All the St. Louis kids on the roster, and it was obviously intended for Samuel and Pemba's, like, oh, St. Louis to Notre Dame, like this is the pipeline now, right? So continuing to create those pipelines, because we talk about recruiting being such a relationship building, aspect to it, right? It's not just relationship building with the coaches that are going there. It's like, oh, wow, I know those names. Like I played against those guys. I played with those guys. I know them. They're from the same place that I am. They're from the same state. So creating those pipelines is also very important for this class. And I think that Notre Dame has shown that they're touching different parts of the country that maybe they haven't had as much presence in recent years, which is another paramount parts of this conversation, I think.
And then sort of the final piece of this, Ryan, is summer positioning. And you touched on this at the very beginning. The odds of Cardinal Tate making a decision in April are slim. The odds of Jaden Osbury making a commitment in April are slim to anyone. We're not just talking about Notre Dame, anyone. The odds of Caleb Downs making a commitment in April are slim. And if he does make a commitment, it's not going to be Notre Dame. Maybe Samuel Mpemba does, right? That's another big one out there, And so as we kind of get into April and why April's a big month, I guess we should, before we move on to summer positioning, I mean, there's some other really important guys that I failed to talk about that are important. And Jason Moore is a big one. And we talked a lot about the offensive guys, but defensively, Jason Moore, to me, is going to determine whether or not Notre Dame has a really good defensive line class or an elite defensive line class, because he gives them a definite interior player to, but he's also like a hybrid enough to where if Brennan Vernon outgrows big end, I could see Jason Moore being that guy, right? Or if Tyson Ford's that guy, then I could see Brennan Vernon and Jason Moore if Brennan Vernon keeps growing, but being the inside guy. So the point is, you need that third big-time player. And, Brendan Vernon's a top 50 recruit. Keon's a 5-star. Jason Moore's a top 50 recruit too. And it's been a minute since Notre Dame has landed that many. I mean, it's been since 2011 when they signed Aaron Lynch, Stephon Tuitt, and Nishak Williams in the same class. And sign me up for another class that has players as good as Aaron Lynch and Stephon Tuitt and Nishak Williams in their class. Hopefully those guys have a little bit better attitudes than two of those three guys. But, talent-wise, and I think they do, but talent-wise, I mean, you're talking about getting long. I mean, when Brendan Vernon would then be your shortest guy that lacks the most length, and he's 6'5", with pretty long arms. So Jason Moore's another one, and his situation is interesting, Ryan. So he's in a unique situation where he's been wanting to come back, and I'll allow you to give the clarity to this. He's been wanting to come back to Notre Dame for a while, but there's understandable reasons why he hasn't been able to make the trip back.
Yeah, he's been wanting to come back in April. I think it probably would have happened already, but of course,
in March.
Yes,
honestly, yeah.
Yeah, it would have happened a lot sooner than when it's going to happen, just because the whole situation. So basically, Jason's brother, Justin, is a basketball player for the University of Villanova. They made a deep run into the playoffs. Obviously, they made it to the Final Four. Justin, unfortunately, suffered an injury during the tournament. That was
a Sweet 16 game. Right?
It may have been the Sweet 16 game. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So he suffered a bad injury. And I talked to the mom of both of them, and she just basically said, like, we're trying to figure out travel plans, but we're doing, it's the NCAA tournament. I need to be there for Justin. It's like, yeah, it makes total sense. I completely get that. And then it got delayed again when Justin gets injured because he has to have surgery now, right? So obviously the family needs to be around to help him in that instance as well. So it's been delayed a little bit, but I am told by the family that Jason really likes Notre Dame. Likes him a ton. He really, really does like Notre Dame. He wants to get back, and he especially wants to see a practice. Like, he wants to see the team in person. He wants to see them underneath Coach Freeman, because he hasn't seen that in person yet.
Right.
And Coach Washington, of course. Yeah, he hasn't seen the new staff in place, since the last time he came. So he wants to see how everything's moving, the energy around the program, all that good stuff. So I feel good about where they are with Jason Moore. And I feel like some people are going to be like, oh, it's a bad sign that he hasn't been back, but there is context to why he has not been able to make that trip back. So I think consider that context of it.
Right. And that's the unfortunate thing, is the knee injury with the brother, and the fact that that's what pushed it back. Is you hate that they're going through that, but it's just one of those things where it's like, look, it can reaffirm to you that, like, you need to make sure whatever decision you make, the game can be taken away from you like that. It's unfortunate, but that explains why. Now I'm hoping that he can get back the week before the blue gold game would be my hope. Because I do believe from talking to different people that Jason does not want his recruitment to drag on a whole lot longer. You've gotten that impression as well from talking to him and his mom, that I think he'd like for this to be done sooner rather than later. But he's also a smart kid, and having an older brother that's gone through this for a different sport, but similar process. You want to make sure that you want to make sure that you make the right decision for the right reasons at the right time. But also, I don't think Jason really, he doesn't talk to the media. He doesn't do a whole lot of I don't think he really is one of those kids that enjoys, the recruiting process. I think he wants to find the right school wherever it is and make his decision and be done with it. And I kind of like guys like that, but guys like that tend to like Notre Dame a lot because they're not necessarily the spotlight. It's not that he's afraid of the spotlight. He doesn't care about it. He doesn't chase it. I think he just wants to go out and do his thing and put into work and play and be a football player, as opposed to a guy that's on social media all the time and a guy that loves seeing his name in print and all that kind of stuff. And and I think he did an interview with another network that it was spun in a way that I don't think he wanted it spun. And since then, I don't think we've heard a word from him, like publicly, really. No. And I kind of respect that because it's in this day and age, you don't find a ton of that from guys who are top 50 national recruits, Ryan. And I kind of dig it.
Yeah, it's pretty consistent across the board with some of the guys Notre Dame's targeting or has commitments from. I mean, like Brendan Vernon doesn't like the media attention, right? Like at all. Charles Jagasaw is not that guy either. Like he likes to be kind of off the grid as well. Even Dante Moore, for a 5-star quarterback, like he doesn't talk much to media or do any of that type of stuff either. So I think it's a pretty consistent, like you said, it's across the board that those kids tend to really like Notre Dame. And I agree that Jason is a very important player in this class, not only for just the fact that like he's a really good football player and he could play a couple different positions potentially. Also, the part that we talked about is getting into that Maryland, the DMV side of, the large portion of DMV anyway. Yeah. Getting into those Catholic schools. Cause like for the longest time I was always like, because DeMatha is not far from me. It's only a couple hours, south or whatever. I'm always like, why does Notre Dame never get anybody from DeMatha Catholic? Like it seems like an easy transition. And when I talked to Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah's younger brother, Owusu Boateng. Yes. When I spoke to him, he said like, yeah, I mean, like, obviously I know a lot about Notre Dame, but he's like, it'd be such an easy transition going from DeMatha Catholic to Notre Dame, like all the same values and just kind of like, it just makes total sense, obviously from the side of the actual school dynamics. So yeah, I think it's very important.
If you think of all the great defensive linemen that have come through that area, just that the Catholic schools in those areas in the last 6-7 years, I mean, Terrell Hall, Terrell Lewis, whichever one it is now. I mean, Chase Young. I mean, it's just like Bama's gone up there. Ohio State goes there. Notre Dame's got some kids from there. I mean, you got DJ Brown. Cam Hart was obviously a big one from that area. Sam Musser. So they've got some kids, but you just think that it would be a regular thing.
Sure.
And I think that, if you can, I think the timing of Cam Hart wrapping up his career and Jason Moore maybe making that decision to transition could be something that could really help Notre Dame. If Cam Hart has the kind of finish to his career that we think he can have, then all of a sudden, and then you get it. Oh, wow. They also got, him from DeMatha and all that. Then all of a sudden, and there's some other kids from the region they're going after. It's not like he's the only guy. They want Devin Houston, who's a Maryland kid, right? I mean, so there's a lot of kids in the class from that DC, Maryland area that Notre Dame really wants. And if they're able to get some of those guys, boy, if that could open up a pipeline for Notre Dame down the road, you're talking about that. Those are impact. They don't produce a ton of guys, but the guys they tend to produce are impact players.
Are dudes, yeah. And their touch is even extending a little further down into the Carolinas. Like Notre Dame has several prospects, like Monroe Freeling, obviously, is a South Carolina kid. Sullivan Absher is a North Carolina kid. So there's Sam Pendleton.
Right, yep. and those areas Notre Dame's even had more. If Notre Dame could have the success in Maryland and DC that they've had in North Carolina in the last 6-7 years, oh my gosh. I mean, the freakiest athlete in the entire country, and I don't think it's close, is a Maryland kid. Yeah, he's a Maryland kid, Nicholas Harbor.
Yeah.
He's a 6'5", 230-pound kid who just ran a 10.3. And that's not 10.3 like, oh, we're reporting. No, that was like a state track meet. I mean, it's absurd, this stuff. So that's what Maryland's producing. I mean, it's producing big time players. And again, it's not 30 of them, but pound for pound, so to speak, boy, it's produces some guys. Virginia, I mean, some of the best athletes that Notre Dame has landed in the last 10 years are Virginia kids. I mean, CJ Prosise and Chris Tyree alone are two of the most explosive athletes that Notre Dame has landed in the last 10 years. And so that region is important. And again, it goes back to the whole theme of the more you get big-time players from, and it's not just any player, but big-time players, guys that when you land that kid, other people in that region are like, whoa, that guy's going to Notre Dame? Oh, wow, right? Because it's different than landing Cam Hart. Cam Hart wasn't considered a big-time player, even though, Ryan, I think if you remember, I had him ranked as a 4-star kid. I loved Cam Hart as a receiver. But Jason Moore is that guy he's that big name. And it just is another one. I mean, getting him, Samuel Mpemba, Ronan Hannafin, it's interesting. Somebody asked me this, like, do you think Notre Dame not taking Ronan Hannafin is going to hurt them down the road? I said, wait a minute, timeout. What are you talking about? Notre Dame never didn't take Ronan Hannafin. Like, I want to reiterate that, Ryan. They never said Ronan don't come. He had expressed a desire to, hey, I love Notre Dame. Everybody thinks it's the place he wants to go, but he also said, I want to go through the process. And you know what? Good for you. And so if they are able to still keep him as in the class, and again, they're going to have to close on him because his offer list has changed. If they can change Ronan, or if they can still get Ronan Hannafin, it's going to end up being the best thing to ever happen to Notre Dame that they didn't take him when he visited the first time. Because since he left Notre Dame that last time, he has gotten offers from Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, and I think today was Oklahoma, and then USC. So this kid now is not just some random private school kid from Massachusetts. This is 3-star that nobody's ever heard of. You now beat Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, Oklahoma, and USC for him.
I think Alabama offered him as a wide receiver as well. Just kind of put that out there.
I'll bet you $20 that of those 5 schools, he's been offered by at least 2 different positions.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think he wants to play receiver, and Notre Dame has no problem with that, by the way. None. So he's another one, Ryan, that even though he doesn't come with the recruiting ranking standpoint, the offers he's getting, people are taking notice of that kid. Believe me.
Yeah.
And it's just another one. So like those are, to me, like of all the guys that we mentioned, I could see all of them making a decision in April. Dante Moore, Jade Lamar, Braylon James, Charles Jagasaw, Jason Moore, and Ronan Hannafin. I think Samuel Mpemba's a guy that I don't know if he will or not. The other two is the last part of this April aspect of it is the offensive line class is going to largely be determined by your success in April. Not just Charles Jagasaw, but you're going to have Monroe Freeling, Austin Saraveld, Sam Pendleton, and Sullivan Absher all on campus in the month of April. Now, there's some other kids that Notre Dame wants to get on campus down the road, Samson Okunlola, Elijah Page, but they're going to have to get at least one of those guys, if not 2, to really have the kind of class I think they need. And if we're being honest, some of those guys are not going to have the same impact in this class that others would, if we're being honest. I don't think Sam Pendleton, no matter what we may think of him a player, moves the needle the way that a Jagasaw and a Monroe Freeling does, in my opinion. So I think they need at least one of those guys along with an Austin Saraveld, a Sam Pendleton, or a Sullivan Absher, right? Like you need at least, obviously, ideally, you get Jagasaw and Freeling, I think is the ideal. I think that's Notre Dame's, like, 2 of the top 3 players they want are those 2 guys. And obviously, Okunlola will be the other. They're more realistic than Okunlola. If you can get one of those 2 guys or both, and again, I don't see Monroe Freeling deciding in April. He, to me, is more of a summer positioning situation. But I think the other 3 kids, Absher, Saraveld, and Pendleton, especially Absher and Pendleton, they're in decision-making mode, essentially. Like, these visits are going to determine where they go. There's a lot of buzz about Freeling and Absher to Clemson, which is fine. Clemson's a Final 3 team for Absher. They're a Final 2 team or a top 2 team for Freeling. That's not surprising. but those are also pre-Notre Dame's visit, right? Now, they both were on campus in January, but they've been on campus at Clemson recently. How the visit goes for the blue gold game with them is going to determine whether or not Notre Dame can get them or not. And that's why I say why April's important. It's not always about getting a player in April, Ryan. Sometimes it's about you're not going to be able to get him when he does commit if you don't crush the visit. And I think for Absher and Freeling, if they don't knock that completely out of the park, then it gets tougher, in my view. And Notre Dame people I talked to have been very high on their odds for getting Absher. You've never been quite as sold that Notre Dame was the team to beat for Absher. And so it even adds more to the visit has to go really well for Notre Dame to be able to close on both of those kids. And they're both really good.
Yeah, no, they are both really good. I have always been on the standpoint that I think that Sullivan Absher is going to be harder to get out of the Carolinas than I think Monroe Freeling is. It's just having conversations with them, just talking points, and it's more of just a pulse on the conversation than them straight out saying like, yeah, it's going to be tough to get me out of here type of conversation. I have felt for a long time, Brian, that they were in a good position for Monroe Freeling. I still believe that they are in a good position for Monroe Freeling. Need to close that one, obviously, because Clemson's going to be a tough one because Clemson is in his backyard. He's in the state of South Carolina, so it's not going to be an easy one by any means. But I think that Monroe Freeling is a really big piece to this class because we can talk about Samson Okololo all we want. It's not where it needs to be right now for me to feel positive about it. It just isn't. But I think Monroe Freeling is incredibly important because I think Jagasol can play offensive tackle. I think he can play guard. But for me, he's the only realistic option right now that I can say that might be the future left tackle, which is obviously the most important position on the offensive line.
To me, Jagasol, in my opinion, has the athletic ability once he gets coached to be a left tackle. But I would make the argument with him that I made about Blake Fisher. Little different because he's not Blake Fisher. But the thing I said about Blake Fisher is I think Blake Fisher can be great anywhere. It's about finding out what best fits his demeanor, and that's why I love Blake Fisher at right tackle. Because we're starting to see Blake play with a little bit more attitude. He's getting some chippiness to him because I think he's kind of got that I want to destroy you mentality. And just for me personally, Ryan, I like that guy at right tackle. Now, I'd love it if I had both of those guys. But, give me just a elite, never give up a pressure guy at left tackle. I don't care if he's dominant as a run blocker or not. At right tackle, I want a guy that's a dominant physical player. And that's why I say, for me, Jagasol is a right tackle guy that could potentially, with the youth with the talent Notre Dame does have at tackle, could eventually say, man, this kid's too good of a player not to get on the field, and he could also be a great guard. A lot of things I say about Blake Fisher, the athleticism, the physicality, the demeanor fits for Jagasol, and he's an elite wrestler. And, so he's going to have the hand. So once he gets coached, he has a chance to be special. But, the thing, too, about this whole summer positioning thing, Ryan, is if you can have success with Jagasol, Freeling, and then one of Absher, Saraveld, and Pendleton, then all of a sudden your O-line class is set. You can put now all your attention on Samson Okunlola. But now you have a class to go with him because I don't know if I've ever met an offensive lineman that Notre Dame recruited or really any offensive lineman that didn't look at what else you were getting on the line with him. Not so much, okay, are you getting another guy to compete with me at my position, but more so like, hey, I can't be the only dude, right? Like they want to be part of a line class. If you're able to get some of those guys, and then all of a sudden it makes it a little easier for you to if you still want to go for, Samson Okunlola, to say, hey, look, if depending on who you get, you may say, hey, look, we love Samson Okunlola, but we're good. We got our 4, and we're going to now focus on the 2024 class. I mean, they could make that decision too. So it's going to be interesting, but I think April is going to be a big, big month for the offensive line recruiting at this point in time, Ryan. Summer positioning aspect of it, Ryan, it's just about I look at Samson Okunlola, I look at Cardinal Tate, I look at Jaden Asbury as the most important guys to where April is going to be important to you really knocking it out of the park with them. Jaden Asbury has not responded to either of us, I don't believe, about whether he is going to come back for the Blue Gold game, so we don't know if he is or isn't. He had said to you, however, that he was going to try.
Yeah.
If you're able to get him back for the Blue Gold game, that's huge. If you're able to convince Cardinal Tate to come back again in April, that's going to be huge. And then, of course, just keep on recruiting Samuel Mpenda, because those are three guys that, to get that number one class, you need more top 50 players, especially 5-stars. Mm-hmm. There's 2 5-stars in that group of 3 and another top 50 player that we just mentioned. And, obviously Mpemba is a 5-star, Cardinal Tate's a 5-star, and then Jaden Asbury is a top 50 player. You need more of those guys to have a number one ranked class.
For sure.
And Notre Dame's got a legitimate chance with all those guys, all of them. But they could also lose all of them. They could also go 0-for-3 in that group. And so April is key to positioning yourself to close in the summer. And that's why April is important with those type of players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because then obviously when you go into, going into the summer, we're talking about officials obviously starting and getting a little bit more of kind of just the context of everything moving forward into when the season starts. So it is a big momentum shift. And I feel like I keep talking about momentum because there's just so much momentum on Notre Dame's side. You can't waste these periods of momentum. If you would have asked me 3-4 weeks ago, what was Notre Dame's chances of getting Jaden Asbury, I probably would have said 0, like maybe 5%, like a very low percentage. I feel so much better about where that is trending right now, but it can't stop right there to feeling pretty solid about it, right? Like it needs to go into another gear where like now you are maybe a favorite here, or you're at least in the top 2 entering the official visit kind of schedule working forward. So it's a big, big chance for guys like Asbury and Mpemba. You need to close the door on some of these guys, and you need to just, more than anything, you need to carry this momentum going into the summer and fall.
Right. When you look at this deal, Ryan, we had this fun conversation the other day, and I'm gonna put you on the spot here before we get to the questions. Do you still have to take that? Do you still have to step out at that period that we talked about before?
Yeah, I might have to in a couple minutes. I'll let you know
though. We'll just kind of dive into questions at that point in time. But we have thrown out different numbers in regards to the over-under number for April for public commitments.
Yep.
Because what we didn't talk about was any 2024 kids, right? And I don't know if they're going to get any 2024 kids in April. It's just it's too early to tell that, really. And usually kids that pop that early, it just kind of comes out of nowhere. But it was started at 2.5, and I raised the bar a little bit on the message board to 5.5. Where would you place it, like as far as just creating a good betting number? Where would you place it in regards to what the over number should be? And are you taking the over? And we're not going to make predictions on it right now because people will take that as they did in the message board. Like, oh, he knows those guys are coming. And no, that's not what I'm saying. But what would you set the number at for public commitments for the month of April? Like kids that make a decision in April, not a kid that visits in April and decides in May, but kids that commit in the month of April. What would your number be?
I think your number was what, 5.5?
5.5 is the betting number. 2.5 is way too low. I think you can make a case that 5.5 is too high.
Yeah. I probably would set the over under at 4.5, go down a little bit. Cause I mean, if you're predicting the over there for 5.5, you're saying at least 6 guys in 1 month. Like that is a massive number. So I'd probably say 4.5. I would go over on 4.5. And honestly, in your post on the message board, I also said over in 5.5. I think it's very possible. So I'm not overly critical of it being 5.5, but I would maybe just lower it a tad to 4.5 to be maybe just a little more reasonable. Well, exactly. I want to win money, right? Like I don't want to just throw my money away. So yeah, for sure.
I gotcha. What do you think the odds are that it's lower than that?
I'm like 70% positive that it's going to be more than 4.5.
Okay.
So like 30%, a pretty low percentage.
I think if it was going to be lower than that, here's the interesting thing. There's a chance Notre Dame could land 3 top 100 players, including a 5-star in the month of March. But if it's only 3, that there will be some people that will consider the disappointment. And my initial reaction to that is to kind of like be frustrated by it. But like the more I thought about it, I don't know if I'd say I'd be frustrated by it, but I could understand why people would be more willing to kind of say, boy, that's a disappointment that they didn't get more guys. Is because I do think they, because I'm looking at it based on who you and I kind of have a good feeling is going to commit in April. If they go less than 4, that's probably not good for Notre Dame in regards to some of the kids that we think they're going to get. And it also means they close
it's dragging out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what's going to make it a little bit interesting. But again, it just kind of adds to the idea of why this month is so important. And again, it may seem premature to be talking about this in April. But look, guys, this is the direction that recruiting is going. And especially for Notre Dame, because Notre Dame won't have the close that other programs are going to have, right? Like, to be number one, you got to get so far ahead of Bama. Like, do you remember a couple years ago when Ohio State had that start and everybody's like, no one's going to catch Ohio State? Yeah, Georgia did. You know what I mean? It was just like, and they lost some guys. But it's really about just getting so far ahead now that it's almost impossible for those teams to catch you. And I think the other part of it too is the guys that we're talking about are guys that if you get Jaden Osbury, Samuel Mpemba, Dante Moore, Braylon James, I'm just trying to kind of go through some of the names we talked about on the show today. If you get them, it also means they're not going to those schools. Monroe Freeling. It means if you get him, it means Clemson isn't. If you get Cardinal Tate, it means Ohio State isn't. If you keep Keon Keeley, it means Alabama's not getting them. If you get Samuel Mpemba, it means, Bama's not, or Florida. I mean, so the list kind of just goes on and on and on, and that's the reason some of these guys are so important. And that's why, but that's also why we say, Ryan, is I'm going to wrap this up this way before we go into questions. That's the biggest difference between this class and past classes is so many of these kids that Notre Dame is going after that we've talked about are kids at Ohio State, Bama, Clemson, Georgia, USC, Oklahoma, Texas are all after.
Right.
This isn't like some kid that they found early that became a highly ranked guy down the road. These are guys that are big-time recruits now that those big-time schools want now. And I think that's what makes us unique. But the one thing we got to learn about this staff is how well it closes. Because if we're being honest, this staff, as it's constituted now, has landed one commitment.
Sure.
And that's Preston Zinter. As excited as we are about Chancey Stuckey, he hasn't landed anybody yet, right? There's no public commitments at receiver yet. Same with Al Washington. Same with Harry Heastand, right? Same with Dylan McCullough. And same with Al Golden. So we like what we're hearing, but again, that just is kind of, to me, why April's so important, because at some point in time, these guys have to say, I'm on the board, right? I'm on the board. Let's get this thing going.
Right.
Because the other practical part of that too, Ryan, is when you start filling up a class, you now have the ability to kind of turn the screws a little tighter on some of the other kids that you want to enjoy the process. Hey, you can enjoy the process all you want, but here's the reality. We need 3 receivers, and we can get that kid right now. So, do you want to be here? Now, that doesn't work with a Cardinal Tate, right? Because Cardinal would be like, all right, cool. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't work with Sam. It's more of some of the other guys, right? Like, if you really want to be here, we need to know, right? Like, hey, Samuel Mpemba, we know you want to enjoy the process. But, like, everything I heard – I talked to a source today, another person today that was like, and it have every time I talk to somebody that's ever spent time, man, Samuel Mpemba loves Notre Dame, but not willing to pull the trigger. At some point in time, I'm like, hey, look, we gotta go somewhere else, right? So that's going to be another interesting part of this, right? As you start to build more commitments, it gives you the ability to turn to some of those offensive linemen. Maybe you want to say, hey, man, you better get up here pretty quickly if you want to be a part of this thing, right? And I think that's also something that adds to it. So anything else to kind of add before we jump into these questions, Ryan?
No, I'm ready for questions. I'll say also I do not need to leave anymore, so we're good.
Perfect. Perfect. Rob Osgood starts things off here with our question and answer session today. And Rob says, hey, folks, during the blue and gold game, are alumni allowed to talk to recruits? I know the staff is doing great with bringing in alumni. I am excited to see this staff is doing compared to the past. They're allowed to talk to them like while they're on campus. Yes. Yeah. There's certain rules and restrictions about the contact they can have with them away from campus. But yes, they're allowed to talk to them on campus. Here's a good one that I wanted to bring up, Ryan. This is a good – I like these kind of questions. Jordan Schreiber says, who are some of the prospects that you feel Notre Dame can pull off as upsets, but you can't use Cardinal Tate?
Okay. I mean, I guess Jaden Osbury would be the first one that pops into my head, right? Like, I didn't think that they were in good position at all for Jaden Osbury for a little bit there, and I guess that would be a little bit of an upset. I'll throw one out there. I don't know if I would say a good chance, but I feel that it's trending in a better direction than I thought it would at one point is Jaden Greathouse out of Westlake in Texas. I feel that it's definitely going into a better direction because, I mean, when they initially offered him and started making the push for him, I just didn't think that it was most likely that he was going to leave the state of Texas, but I think that that's just more possible now than it was. I'd say Jaden Lamar is a little bit of an upset to a degree if Notre Dame's able to land him. He's a guy that I think when Coach Taylor was here, he had a great relationship with him. And this is the reason I say this is that when Coach Taylor left, it's not a fractured relationship, but it was a transitional period where it was like, you know, how serious are they going to get back in with Jaden? How is Jaden going to kind of react to a new coach? You know, so I feel like it's a little bit of an upset in that regard. But I would say Osbury, Greathouse are the two guys that really pop into my head quickly. Other than that, I feel like all the guys we've talked about, Notre Dame's kind of been in a good position for a little bit. So I don't know who else would really constitute as a upset type.
I'm trying to think of guys that they're maybe in a good place now. I think Monroe Freeling would be a bit of an upset if they get him.
Nope. I've been telling you that one for months, sir.
No, not from that standpoint. But I think if we would have gone back to the beginning of this process, and if I would have told you they're going to get a Monroe Freeling out of South Carolina before you ever talk to him,
sure.
Before any of that stuff, if we'd have talked back in December and I said, hey, watch Monroe Freeling's film. This kid's really good. He's from South Carolina. Clemson wants him. Yeah, Notre Dame's going to get that guy. I think you probably would have had some skepticism on that, right? So it's kind of like the Jaden Lamar thing, right? Like, I think it's not an upset in regards to where they stand now, but I think it might have been 5 months ago when we looked at Braylon James would be that way.
Oh, for sure.
Right. When this whole thing started, like when I might have even said in this show, I think if I remember correctly, I believe Braylon James' name was brought up once in January. And I was like, he ain't coming to Notre Dame. I think that actually I've said it before. I don't know if it was on a show or in a personal conversation, but I think it was on a show, Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, not because again, Texas's backyard. Texas wanted him, big time player, top 100 guy, tons of talent. I'm like, the Notre Dame's not going to get that guy, right? And then now, bam, you look at it, they're in a great position for him. So he'd be one that I consider an upset. But looking at guys that I think would be upsets based on where Notre Dame stands right now, I think would make for a more interesting conversation. And in that regard, I think Jaden Greathouse would be one because I don't think Notre Dame is his leader right now. I think Texas is.
Sure. I
think Deuce Robinson would be one for me because right now Notre Dame's not really in the game. You know, he still talks to them, but they're not really in the game, right, Ryan? And that what you talked to him recently?
Yeah. No, I didn't get a great feeling. I think somebody put into the chat, which was a good one, was Micah Tease would be obviously an upset getting him out of Oklahoma. That's a good one.
That would be one. That would be one. Jaden Osbury, you mentioned, would be one. And the biggest one for me that I hope that someday I get comfortable enough to throw Caleb Downs into this conversation.
Same here, man.
But I'm not there yet because that's the one people keep asking about. Like that would be the ultimate upset that could have.
Yeah,
that would be the big one for me.
Someone said Rodney Gallagher. I don't consider that an upset because I don't think he has a leader. Like he just doesn't have a leader at the moment.
Here's why they think that because of the way that the recruiting services are with Penn State's going to get hard to beat. I never bought that, Ryan. You and I never bought that because he wasn't really engaged in the recruiting process.
Right.
And the other thing is that if he's going to go to a school like that, I mean, I think West Virginia would be a better option from where he lives. Morgantown, and he's camped at West Virginia. Morgantown's a much closer to him than Penn State is. But I just don't view that one as an upset, because there was no hierarchy to me for him, and that's the key. Was there a hierarchy in place? Did you have a doubt? Like, not. We always felt that if Notre Dame staff would get their heads out of their whats and go after this kid, they'd have a good shot. That's what we always felt.
Mm-hmm.
Just the previous staff didn't get their heads out of their whats, which is why they're employed other places now.
It's fair.
Jordan says, do you think Harry Hiestand should be getting majorly involved with running back recruiting so he can describe the line they'll be running behind? No. I mean, that's a conversation you have as an addition. Hey, Coach Hiestand, can you call this kid and talk to him? But majorly involved, no. It's an asset to have him talk to a kid occasionally and to meet with a kid while he's on campus. But no, it's got to be the running back coach and the OC, in my opinion. What say you, Ryan?
Well, I think that Notre Dame has taken the standpoint that there is a collaborative approach to recruiting, but I don't think that it's a necessity for this exact question for Coach Hiestand to explain the blocking schemes that they'll be working behind. Like, I don't think that's why Coach Hiestand would have to reach out to a recruit. I agree that Coach Hiestand should be involved in all of their positions. I mean, running back makes total sense because obviously the relationship between running backs and offensive linemen makes a ton of sense for why he would be involved in the recruitment slightly, but I don't necessarily think that he needs to do it from the schematical perspective. That could be something you talk about, but I don't think it's like, oh man, he said he needs to get in there because he needs to talk schematics with the running backs. I don't necessarily agree with that portion of it.
Here's a good one from John A1. When IB did the 2-year look at Notre Dame classes, both D-end and D-line were short on numbers. What's the right answer for defensive line recruiting numbers in 23? John, this is a good one. So we talked about this a little bit in a recent show, and right now the number's 4. And I think Notre Dame is in a position where they want to get a guy at all 4. They want to get a guy that projects at Viper, that's Keon Keeley. They want to get, a couple guys that project as big end 3-tech hybrids, which is Brennan Vernon and Jason Moore, and then they'd like to get a nose tackle, right? Nose guard. That's the thing that makes this interesting, because like Boubacar Traore wants to come. He likes Notre Dame a lot, and whenever he visits, I think Notre Dame would have a very good shot with him. But if you got him and Jason Moore, I think there's concern from the staff about who of that group of 4 would be the nose guard. And I think that's the concern. And so then you get into a situation of, okay, well, if you get Jason Moore and you want to have a pure nose guard and you don't think any of those other guys can be a nose guard, then can you take Boubacar as your 4? So if the number stays at 4, that's the target number now, then it's going to get a little interesting. But I do know that, as we've said before, there are people at Notre Dame pushing to take 5, and personally, I would take 5. I think the fact that you had to take a grad transfer to help out your current depth chart is, for me, why I would go for 5. And I'm a believer, Ryan, that if you're in a position where you can load up, you load up. And when I mean can load up, I'm not talking about just take as many guys as you can, but I think 5 in this class would be the number that makes the defensive line moving forward the healthiest, because there's such really good players in this class. I mean, you're talking about if Devin Houston and Boubacar and Jason Moore all wanted to come to Notre Dame, you're talking about Devin Houston as a top 180 player is your lowest ranked guy. And for me, I don't think he wouldn't grade out as the lowest guy for me. I'd probably put Boubacar at the bottom of that list because he's so raw. He'd probably be my 5 of that 5. I don't know what you think about that, Ryan. He'd be 5 of my 5. It would be Keon Keeley, Jason Moore, Brennan Vernon, Devin Houston, and Boubacar would be how I rank them. But if I was then going to talk about upside, then Boubacar goes up my list a little bit.
That's fair.
So yeah, no question about it. So, by the way, Alex Birchmeyer is not from the state of Pennsylvania. By the way, he is from Virginia. So let's be accurate with those comments. So yeah,
can't insult the state of Virginia like that, right, Brian?
Seriously, it was blasphemy. So he is not the best from Pennsylvania. They do not get to take the players from Virginia. But I'm sorry, with all due respect, It depends on which part of Pittsburgh are you from. If you're from the eastern part of the state, then I'd be a little bit more worried. He's a Western PA kid. Notre Dame consistently beats Western PA, Penn State for Western PA kids, consistently. So I'm not as concerned by it. And you could give me a kid here and there, but with all due respect, Notre Dame and Penn State haven't exactly battled for a lot of kids from the state of Pennsylvania, especially this staff, right? So, I mean, whatever. So, Ryan, I basically the point I made was 4's the number now. I'd like to go to 5. Yeah. If you get Jason Moore, it makes the 4th a little intriguing on who's the nose, which is another reason why I'd go for 5.
I think I would go for 5 too, because you're projecting a lot to who the interior players are right now, right? Because you have, Keon Keeley is a true Viper. Maybe he could be a strong side end down the road, depending on physical development. Brendan Vernon is a strong side end that maybe could be a 3-tech down the line. Jason Moore is the same. He's a strong side end, probably initially, and then maybe he's a 3-tech. So there's projection. You're thinking one of those guys is going to end up on the interior, but we'll see what the growth is like for both of them, right? So that is the conversation for the top 3 of the targets. And then after that, Devin Houston's more of a true nose, but even with him, still a little absence of size, right? So you're projecting Boubacar Traore is a 255 pounds defensive lineman right now. Is he going to be a nose down the line as well? So Notre Dame doesn't really have a ton of weight in the class. Like, they have size because they have developmental potential to add a ton of weight, but they're not recruiting just like true interior players. They're recruiting a lot of hybrid players. So I would push it to 5 just because you're projecting so much development with your guys. I would be a little more settled on taking numbers and letting those numbers shake out, if that makes sense.
We had a super chat here from, I love this one. Let me find from Alex Udell. Just here to say I'm not going to ask about Dante Moore. But you know what? You joined the right show, Alex, because we talked a lot about Dante Moore. I wanted to get to I'm going to jump down here for one because I wanted to get to this. This is from Stonador. I think I'm saying that correctly. He said, it's April 7th. Should we really expect that much to happen over the next three or so weeks? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you should. That's the reason we're having the conversation today. Is because we expect it. I think if anything, one of the things you could say about us is I think we're pretty reasonable. I don't think we have silly expectations, and if we are reaching, we'll say it. I think Notre Dame getting Caleb Downs would be a humongous upset that I don't see happening right now. We don't think Notre Dame right now is a major player for Samson Okunlola, like as much as I'd love to say it. But yeah, based on what we know and who we think will make decisions in April, or who is thinking about making a decision in April that we know of. And this isn't a situation where, like, we're not giving you part of the reason we're having this. So Stoner, to your question, if our stance was, if all these kids come to the blue gold game, then I think X could happen. That would be a bit foolish to think it was all going to be because of the April 23rd blue gold game. We are looking at the blue gold game as a sort of a conclusion of the month of April.
Falling action.
Right.
Falling action.
We expect things to happen beforehand. And it's not always, as we've also made clear, I want to make sure people understand this. It's not just about getting commitments from guys in April. You're going to have all these kids on campus. So Dante Moore was on campus at the end of March. He's sort of in decision-making mode. Charles Jagasaw is going to be on campus in March. Monroe Freeling, Sullivan Absher, Austin Saraveld was on campus in March. Sam Pendleton's going to be on campus in March. So 5 of your 7 linemen that you're really pushing for right now will be on campus in April. It's, as we've said also, it's not just about landing them in April. It's about putting yourself in position to land them because of what happens in April, right? So we said earlier, like, and I hope I said it correctly. And if I didn't say this, then I misspoke, and please forgive me. I would be shocked if Monroe Freeling made a decision in April. Like, shocked. I don't see it happening based on where he is right now. Now, could a visit on April 23rd change things? Sure. But that's not my prediction. Same thing with Caleb Downs is visiting for the April 23rd Blue Gold game. Jaden Osbury was on campus in March, right? Like some of these guys you're hoping that these visits in March and April position you for down the road success. But we also know of several players that either are going to come in. Braylon James is committing April 19th somewhere, right? So that's going to happen. We believe there's a couple other kids that we believe are going to make decisions in April. Some we feel good about Notre Dame. Some, we'll see. I'm not quite so sure. So, yeah, we expect a lot of this to happen. But I want to make sure people understand we're not talking about Notre Dame needing to get 9 commitments in April for this to be a successful month. They could only get 3 this month, and it's going to be considered a disappointment. But practically speaking, as long as they've positioned themselves well with those kids that don't commit, that's important. Positioning and momentum is important in this business because if you're always trailing other schools for a kid, it always makes it harder for you to be in a position. And here's more importantly, right? If you're trailing for all your top prospects, that means you have to put in even more work, and it's hard to put in that much work for that many kids. It just is. And so all of these things factor together. So I just wanted to make sure that people understand we are not saying Notre Dame's going to get 15 commitments in the next 3 weeks. It's not what we're saying. I do think it's reasonable to expect around 5. That's why we kind of had the discussion about the over-under based on who we know is going to commit and who may also commit. Is that a fair representation of where we're coming from, Ryan?
Yeah, no, it is. And Stonador, I would say this. If I have not earned my paycheck yet, I certainly will over the next 3 weeks. It's going to be very busy. I think that there's going to be a lot of breaking news that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of, visit recaps, visit previews, some commit stories. There's going to be a lot of stuff happening, man. So, yes, just stay tuned. I do believe that it's going to be very busy. And, man, we have a lot of LSU fans that love to join the chat nowadays, man. I don't know what's going on here.
I love it because, well, they're gone now.
Good.
I love it because they are so thinking that Brian Kelly's going to be this amazing thing. And they're going to be so like, man, I never said that. It's not going to take long for them to feel that way. So it's hilarious. I
would just like to say one thing, and I know he's not even in here anymore, but someone said like, oh, you guys are upset that Kelly left or something. I'm going to put this out one time and I'm never going to say it again. Okay. When the news broke that Brian Kelly was gone, I went and I hugged my wife. Okay. That's all I want to say is that
wrong channel, bro. There are channels you can maybe go say that about. This ain't it.
That's not
coming to this channel being like, you're just mad Brian Kelly left. You're clowning yourself at this point.
I hugged my wife with a near tear in my eye, okay? So I don't want to hear anything about Brian Kelly.
You know very well my opinion and anyone that's been in this. So it's kind of cool. Like I was out at Trader Joe's yesterday with my wife, and a guy recognized the Irish Breakdown gear. He didn't recognize me because he hasn't watched the show since the beard came off. Really nice guy, really, really kind guy. But he was one of maybe literally, Ryan, 300 messages I've got either directly, personally, email, text, DM of, I started watching your channel when Brian Kelly left Notre Dame. So just as a business owner, I'm not upset that Brian Kelly left because he's helped my business grow. But even before that, people that were on this channel before that, there's no one in their right mind that's going to be like, you guys are just mad that Brian Kelly left. You're just clowning yourself at that point in time, partner, because this ain't the channel for that, my man. And you're just showing how dumb you are. And, you need to go back and I'm not going to say what else I want to say. But, these clowns, it's hilarious. You're just mad Brian Kelly left. No. Yeah, I'm really pissed about that number 1 ranked recruiting class that Notre Dame's dealing with this freaking Marcus Freeman guy's working on. I'm really upset about that. Oh my goodness gracious. All right, Matthew Jackson says, just found this community a couple weeks ago and I haven't been able to get enough. Lots of love, IB Nation, and go Irish. Brian and Ryan, y'all are the GOATs. Well, I certainly don't believe that first part of that comment is true regarding that, because as you know who I think is the GOAT in this business for Notre Dame coverage, and that is the late, great Loose Emoji. But I appreciate that at least one person thinks that, and I truly mean that. It does mean a lot. Lucas Strittmatter says, Coach D, who do you have winning the Masters? I have no clue.
I don't follow golf either.
I only know the names of 2 golfers, and that's Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson. That's about it. And I'm sorry. I'm not a golf guy.
I can name a couple more golfers, but I don't pay attention to it close enough to.
Is Jack Nicklaus in it? I don't know. Like
Nicklaus.
Is Vijay Singh playing in this? Like, I'm not sure. I don't keep up on golf. I have no idea, Ryan. I don't know if you follow golf enough. But all I know is a buddy of mine called me today and he was talking about the Masters, how excited he was. And he was asking me a similar question. And I was like, dude, I'm sorry, buddy. I don't have a clue. He was telling me about Tyler. I didn't know that Tiger Woods got like a real bad. I didn't know that he got in a real bad car accident. And it's like a miracle that he's even walking, much less competing in the Masters. So I think that's pretty cool. I might just pay attention how he does just for that storyline, but I'm just not a golf guy. I enjoy golfing. I just am terrible at it. And so I can only go with people who also enjoy golfing, as just enjoy being out on the golf course. I don't particularly love golfing. I like being out on the golf course and having fun. But so many people just take it way too seriously that I just can't do it, man, because I am terrible. I know I'm terrible. And if you're trying to be serious and all that, you're not going to have fun playing golf with me.
Apparently VJ is playing, Brian. So you got that one.
Wow.
Apparently.
That dude's been around for a minute. Okay. Ernie Els, is he still in it? Like, those are the only, I really just don't know. I know there's a dude that wears like a funky hat that's been in commercials, but if a golfer hasn't been in a commercial, I don't know who he is. So I'm sorry. And I'm not one of those people like golf's not a sport. Look, a sport to me is something that requires great skill. You don't have to be a 4.4 40 guy or bench 500 pounds to be great for it to be a sport. That's my belief. So like bowling, people say bowling's not a sport. It can't be a sport and be a beer belly. Well, then baseball's not a sport. Because you ever seen David Wells? But to me, a sport is something that requires a unique physical. It's kind of like the cereal thing. Is this a sport or not? But I have a great deal of respect for golfers because I've tried it and I'm terrible at it. You know what I mean? It's just not something I enjoy to watch. It's like racing. I would love to drive a NASCAR. I think that'd be so much fun. I have zero desire to sit and watch someone else drive a car. That's just my thing, but it doesn't mean I don't appreciate that others do it. So I don't have any golf jokes other than just Lucas. I have no clue about who would be playing in the Masters other than Tiger. Is Phil Mickelson in the Masters?
Probably.
Did he do something stupid recently or something like that and got in trouble? I don't know.
Not
I
sure.
think I might have seen that on Twitter, because everything on Twitter is real. John A1, as far as the recruits, the staff is prioritizing to bring in the class. Do the recruiting services aligned to actually rank Notre Dame number 1? Yeah, right, John. That's kind of the whole point of this whole thing, right? Like, we did that show a few weeks ago, Ryan, where we talked about like what it would take. So we looked at like the last 10 classes, and we did that Notre Dame Dream class, which I still think is very possible. If not, actually, I think there's a couple guys that I feel better about now than I did when we did that Dream class thing. And if they sign that class, it is right in line with what has been a number 1 ranked class each of the last 10 years. Some years are better, other years are not as good, but it's in that range. So, yeah, I think that as long as the recruiting services don't just drop every time a kid commits to Notre Dame, I absolutely think that from a recruiting – I mean, we've talked about the practical number 1 class, Ryan. To John's question, as far as the recruiting rankings, yes, I believe that they can – and I don't think it's going to happen often, but this is one of those unique years where there's multiple 5-star recruits within 2.5 hours of Notre Dame's campus, if we're going to refer to Cardinal Tate as a northern guy. Charles Jagasaw is a top 100 recruit that is ranked as a top 10 player nationally by On3. That's from Illinois. That's not going to happen a lot, right? You're not going to find that a lot. And that's what makes, you're not going to be able to find a year very often where Notre Dame could get, let's just say they finish with this class, where Notre Dame's going to be able to get the type of skill talent that is a Dante Moore, Cardinal Tate, and Rodney Gallagher, and it's all from the north. It just doesn't happen often. That you're going to get 2 top 50 caliber defensive linemen from the north, referring to maybe potentially a Jason Moore and a Brennan Vernon. It just doesn't happen every year. And so that's also what makes this year a bit unique, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So anything to add to that there, Ryan?
No, I mean, I think you said it perfectly. At some point, with the players that Notre Dame is in good position with and that could potentially close on, I don't think that even a drop in huge rankings can stop a potential for number one, because Notre Dame's doing work, man. It's just point blank period to it. They're doing work.
Matt S. says, Cardinal Tate said in an interview with Sean, he could commit to Notre Dame whether Dante Moore does or not. He did say that. He has said that. But he also said he wants to go somewhere with a big-time quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't get Dante Moore, they're not going to get a big-time quarterback. Chris Vizina is not a guy that's going to convince Cardinal Tate to want to go play with him. I'm sorry. He's just not. The only big-time commits that I think Jackson Arnold could have a big-time impact on is Peyton Bowen, right? So, yeah, he could, but he's not. I mean, that's the whole thing is based on the criteria that Cardinal has said he's looking for. Because here's the thing. If this was just about Cardinal's feelings about Notre Dame, he would have already committed to Notre Dame.
Sure.
Cardinal loves Notre Dame. But Cardinal is also a really smart kid. And he understands that my love of a school can't be where this decision comes from. It also has to be about who's giving me the best opportunity to go become a professional football player, which means I want to go somewhere I'm going to get developed. I want to go somewhere that's kind of a great quarterback. Someone's going to have other good receivers. There's all these criteria that a smart, thoughtful kid is going to think about. And that's the thing you have to understand is Cardinal is not going to make an emotional decision. Because if he was, he'd already be in Notre Dame's class. He is a smart kid. And he understands that without a Dante Moore, look, if Notre Dame landed Nico or Malachi Nelson or Arch Manning, yeah, they'd still have the same great shot. But the reality is if they don't get Dante, because here's the other thing, I believe Chris Vizina is on the verge of committing to Clemson. His dad went to college with Dabo Swinney. You're not flipping that kid from Clemson, in my opinion. You're just not, right?
Yeah.
So who's the quarterback going to be, right? So you think Avery Johnson is going to be a guy that's going to convince Cardinal Tate to come play with him? No. So that's the thing. Matt, so what you're saying, Matt, is not incorrect. And I'm not pushing back on what you're saying or saying you're wrong. He did say that. I'm trying to add even more context, however. He also said, I want to go somewhere that's going to develop me, has a reputation for developing big-time receivers, and somewhere with a big-time quarterback. Well, the reality is when you look at Ohio State, Notre Dame can't compete with Ohio State when it comes to developing receivers in recent history. They just can't. They can't. And if they also don't have the quarterbacks to compete with Ohio State, the reality is he's not picking Notre Dame. He's just not.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality. So, the Dante Moore piece is going to be a very, very important part to this when it comes to Cardinal Tate because he is a smart kid that's going to make a very thoughtful, wise decision, and it's not going to be off of his emotions. And that's why the Dante Moore piece is so important for him, Ryan, because if you can start checking off his decision box list, then all of a sudden the emotion of how he feels about Notre Dame becomes even more important. And that's why Dante is so important to this for Cardinal.
Yeah, the last meeting or the last visit that he took to Notre Dame what was it, last week or week before? These weeks are starting to mesh a little bit together. It was very recent, though. Cardinal, the main reason for that visit was, and we reported on this, of course, Sean, as the intel there, is to convince the mom, right? To show this staff, because it's a different staff, and they want to be able to meet Coach Freeman and to really get insight and to continue the relationship with Tommy Rees. It like Brian said, this is about checking off boxes outside of the emotional decision. Because again, you could listen to Sean's interview with him on the Lucky Lefty, and you could hear just how much. I mean, did you hear the vibrance in his voice when he was talking about different spots on Notre Dame's campus? He loves the campus, man. He also loves Dante Moore. There's no doubt. I almost cut that clip and put it on the message board when they were just talking about Dante. They are. I mean, he was saying he FaceTimes them with all the time. They talk about where they're going to go to college, just kind of rattle off what's going on in their real world, all that type of stuff. So, Cardinal Tate loves Notre Dame. It's everything around that decision-making process is going to be what determines if he ends up at Notre Dame. But the quarterback conversation is a part of that criteria as well. And it should be. It's a very important part of it.
And it should. I mean, look, if you're a big time receiver and you're not making your decision based off partly on where a kid, who's going to be throwing you the ball, school's proven ability to develop you, all that type of stuff, then you're not making it for the right reasons, if we're being honest. And Cardinal, I don't think people understand how savvy Cardinal actually is. Like, this is one of the more thoughtful, savvy kids that I've seen, especially for a skill player, because skill players are a lot of times about pizzazz, and he has that attitude. But when you talk to Cardinal, or when you watch him engage Malik and Sean, and when you hear about some of the conversations they have off the record, this is a really sharp kid, Ryan, like a really sharp kid. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this whole thing plays out. So let me get back to some more questions here. Oh my gosh, more LSU losers. All right, NH, likelihood of a commitment from any of these players before the blue gold game? Very.
Yes. Yes.
Very. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'd be shocked if they don't have multiple commitments before the blue gold game.
Well, I was going to say this, Brian. Let's change the conversation we had earlier a little bit here.
I think I know where you're going. I like this.
Number of commits over under before the blue and gold game. I'll set it at 2.5.
Ooh. Before the blue public commitments, right? Boy, that's a good one. I'm going to go over because I think it's going to be 3.
I think I would go over as well. Yeah.
But I don't feel as confident about that one as I do the whole thing. Right? So, yeah, I'm going to go over because I think there'll be 3. And I think the 3 that I'm thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
Right? 2 on offense, 1 on defense.
Is
where I'm leaning. Mm-hmm. So that's where I'm at now. I'm confident there's going to be 2. Like, I'm not at all. I'll be shocked if there's not 2. Getting to that third could be a little bit more of a projection than a knowing for a fact that he's going to come. Right? So that's a good one. Ty C, do you think Notre Dame can get Tate, or do you think he is basically a Buckeye? I know he's close with Dante, but I just get the feeling he's all Ohio State. He's not all Ohio State. He's not. And I think part of the reason some people think that is twofold. Number one, it's just that's been the media hype for a while. Number 2 is, again, Cardinal's a savvy kid. He knows how to play the social media game. But do I think Ohio State is the school that I'm most concerned about? Yes, it is. Do I think he's all Ohio State? No. I'm not saying Notre Dame necessarily leads for him either. I'm not saying that at all. I think right now I think if you were to really ask Cardinal where he's leaning, I think if you asked him it every day for a week, you'd probably get at least 2 different answers, maybe a third.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think he has genuine interest in several programs. I do. And if Cody Burns was still the receivers coach at Tennessee, I'd be just as nervous about Tennessee as I would be about Ohio State, because the Burns plus Nico combination would have been tough. Mm-hmm. He really liked the receivers coach at Tennessee. And Ryan, as we talked about, the job he did with that group of receivers this year, I get it. I certainly get it.
Yeah. And I mean, you also have to understand why Cardinal would be interested in Ohio State, right? Like, there's not many schools that have done better producing wide receiver talent over the last few years. I mean, they have more guys that are going to be playing on Sundays in a couple years from now. So there's interest in both areas. It's not just strictly one or the other right now.
Because they're going to have probably 2 first rounders this year, I would imagine. I know you don't have Olave as a first round, like grade.
I did, correct? Not a first round grade, but I put him in my first round mock draft, like 2027. You think
he's going to get picked in the first round, but you don't grade him as 1. So they probably have 2 first round picks this year. Mm-hmm. Barring injury, I would imagine they'll have a third next year, correct? I mean, you see Jackson Smith and Jigba as a first rounder, correct?
Yeah, I like him more than Chris Olave. Yeah.
Right. For an NFL projection, yes. Sure. Agree with that. That's how I'd rank those 3. It's Garrett, it's Jackson, and Olave. That's how I would rank them. So Notre Dame's had 3 first-round receivers picked in, more. They haven't had 3 in 10 years. I mean, Fuller was around 1. Floyd was around 1. Before that, who was the last first-round receiver to go? I mean, I can't. It's been a while. Not a lot of second round picks. Golden Tate was second round. Claypool, but not a lot of first rounders. And we could spend another 30 minutes debating on whether or not Kevin Austin could have been next year if he'd have come back, but we're not going to do that again. Charlie Weiss's last belt loop. Haven't seen you in a while, and he actually now has a picture of Charlie Weiss. That's flipping hilarious. Any word on Ryan? This is for you. Any word on Rico Flores? Because we actually do.
Yeah. He's Rico is visiting also for it's not the Blue Gold game. I apologize.
He's
coming.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he is coming June 10th through the 12th. He will be on campus the same weekend as Cooper Flanagan, the De La Salle commits, also out of the state of California. Looks like, Rico he had a updated top schools, and Notre Dame made that list, and he's going to be coming on June 10th. I still think it's a bit of a long shot for Rico Flores in the class, but getting him on campus is certainly a big step in that recruitment.
From what I'm gathering, Ryan, from talking to different recruits, it sounds like June 10th is going to be their, because every summer they have a big weekend, this is the big weekend.
Yeah,
I believe as of right now, June 10th is going to be that, because there's a lot of commits coming for their officials that weekend, and that's usually a sign that that's going to be the big weekend. Because usually you want your commits around to, help you recruit other players. So I have a feeling that's going to be the case. Laker Irish asks, who are the other players for Braylon James? That's easy, Ryan. Texas, LSU, Stanford, to me, are the three biggest for him. Would you?
Yeah.
And he has his top 9, but I think those are the three that if Notre Dame was going to be concerned, I think those are the three and it would be LSU and Stanford in that order would be the way that I would go.
Yeah, I would say Texas would be a distant bottom of the list there. Like, he just doesn't really care that much about staying close to home. So LSU definitely had some interest there, and Stanford, that was like one of the big ones, Brian. I remember when we had a little bit of an intel that like Stanford's also a big player in this too. We're like, oh, he's a little bit of a different guy.
I would argue that before his LSU visit, Stanford was number 2. Now, there were some people hyping Stanford up more than they should have because they didn't have the intel we had. But if Notre Dame didn't get involved with Braylon James, Stanford would be a much better player for him. And I'll tell you something else right now. If Stanford was the program they were 6 years ago, they'd be much tougher than they are right now. But I think LSU would be the only one that I'd be at all worried about right now. And again, I'm not concerned about LSU at this point in time. We have a couple more receiver questions we'll get to. I'm just going to kind of go in order here. Tommy Gunn says, so beat Ryan. I love that, by the way. That's hilarious. If we get everyone we think, and they hope they will, referring to Notre Dame, what other number 1 classes would it compare to, both locally to Notre Dame and compared to other top teams' best classes in recent history?
I do some research there, right?
Well, based on the numbers, so that dream class we did a month or so ago, what that number would have been, it would be like right in the middle of the last 10 years. Like Bama, A&M's class last year was better. Georgia had 1 class that was better. Bama had 2 that were better, I think. Something like right in the middle of some really darn good classes is where it'd be. Now, if they can pull off a couple upsets, like Jaden Osbury was not part of that thing, right? There was a couple other guys that, like Jaden Lamar, was not part of that class, that dream class we had. So if they were able to get him, for example, if they were able to get a Jaden Osbury, then I think it ups it a little bit. But it's not like the A&M class from last year from a ranking standpoint. Now, I'll take if Notre Dame gets the dream class that we're talking about, I'll take that over Texas A&M's class last year every single day of the week, because I don't want a class where a third-year class is at one position that's not a third of your roster spots. I mean, I'm sorry. That was a very unbalanced class. Now, there's some excellent players in that class at multiple positions. I mean, their receiver class was pretty good too. I love their quarterback, was one of my 3 favorite quarterbacks in the class. But there's also some spots they did not do as well. So I'm just not to call that the best class of the last 10 years, to me, shows the flaw of the ranking system, the points-based ranking system that takes into no account fit, need, or any other context, Ryan. That really was my big issue with it, and why if Notre Dame gets the dream class we've talked about, I wouldn't trade that for A&M's class last year.
That's fair. I mean, what was it, like 7 or 8 defensive line commits,
when
right?
that kid reclassified, Levius Overton reclassified and committed to A&M last week, that gave them 8 defensive linemen.
You're not going to keep all 8 of those kids for long term. Like, you're just not.
Can't play all 8 of those kids. That's the other thing. So you can't play them all. Like, if you loaded up on 5 corners, you could legitimately play all 5 of those corners on the field at the same time, at least 3 or 4 of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just well, you know, you could have a rotation of 2 each. Well, no, because they're not all. There's not 2 big ends, 2 vipers, 2 3-techs, and 2 nose tackles. There's like 6 defensive ends.
I know.
You know, it's just, you know, again, there's parts of that class and look, it's not to say it's not a really good class. Like, that's a heck of a class. And in a lot of years, I would trade that class for Notre Dame's classes. I'm talking about the dream class that we've referred to, you know, which is basically Dante Moore. It would include Jane Lamar, Cardinal Tate, Braylon James, Rodney Gallagher, Charles Jagasaw, Monroe Freeling, 2 of the 5, like Absher, I think was 1. I think another one we did was like either Sarah Veld, I think might have been 1, like not an elite. What we did is like not to where they hit a home run and land every single kid at every position, right? We had Jason Moore and I can't remember who the 4th defensive lineman was. We had Samuel Mpemba, but not Osbury. Yeah. And we only had them adding one corner. I think it was like Christian Gray, who I don't see Notre Dame getting Christian Gray. That's the only guy on the list that I look now. I'm like, I don't think they're going to get that guy. But Christian Gray is not a super, super highly ranked guy. So they're still, and Kenny Moore had a comment about that too. He said he would consider Christian Gray an upset. I would now, but I wouldn't have 3 months ago. But that, to me, that class right there is a special class, because you've literally, Ryan, at that position, you've landed a potential difference maker at every single position.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, when you think about, I mean, so you have a 5-star defensive end, you have a top 50 defensive end on the other side of him, or interior player potentially. If you land a Jason Moore, that's another top 50 kid on the interior. Linebacker wise, I mean, you have a top 50 kid in Drake Bowen, top 40 player in Drake Bowen. You have Samuel Mpemba that's going to, I know, I saw that. I was about to put that up, actually. I was about to put it up. 8-2-1 defense. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I don't know who's going to be covering wide receivers in that defense, but like, I love
it. Wheel routes are going to be a problem for Texas A&M in that defense.
You might have to do 8-1-2 instead. You might need a little something different, but yeah, I mean, like you said, there's at least 2 guys on the second level that are real difference makers. There's at least 2 to 3 on the defensive line that are real difference makers. You have Peyton Bowen on the back end, who is an absolute difference maker. And you also have Justin Rhett, who can be a difference maker if he hits his upside. So yeah, I mean, it's not just like a good, solid player in each spot. You have dudes at multiple spots on that team.
I mean, the 2 positions where you got the least impactful players would be running back and tight end. I mean, when Cooper Flanagan is one of your lowest ranked best players at a position, you've got a heck of a class. I mean, that's, you know what I mean? Like,
I mean, he's ranked at, what was it, 106 by 247? 108?
108,
yeah.
I mean, he's a consensus 4-star recruit. If that's, and actually, you'd probably say Jalen Lamar actually would be the lowest at that point in time.
Fair.
Right? If Jalen Lamar's your worst number 1 guy at a position, you're doing all right. You've got a heck of a class. So, you know, yeah, I to your point, I do believe that Notre Dame has an opportunity to have that kind of class. So somebody also asked this. This has been asked several times. I do want, yes, Braylon James, it has delayed his commit. It's going to be the 19th. My understanding is there's 2 reasons for this. Number 1 is CBS Sports didn't want to have to compete with the Masters, because CBS carries the Masters, correct? Right, Ryan? I believe CBS carries the Masters.
I believe so.
CBS Sports didn't want to have a commitment announcement during the Masters, which is apparently a really popular event. I didn't realize, like, watching the Masters that big. I haven't watched a Masters since I was in college. I watched that one that Tiger won by like 20 strokes. Do you remember? Are you too young?
Yes.
You're probably too
No,
young for that.
I know what
But,
you're talking about.
I mean, I watched that one because, like, at the time, I'm like, Tiger was he was a unicorn. I mean, just
dominant.
like, he was, I mean, just dominant. But he was also like, he looked different. Like, this is a young kid that's like
athletic,
muscular. He's athletic, you know. And then, of course, it was a cool story. So, but I enjoyed watching that. But like, I'll be honest, I was one of those people that only watched golf if Tiger was doing something. If I saw somebody texting me like, yo, I'd turn it on. But that was it. I've never really been a golf guy. But yes, he will be committing on April 19th, I believe is the date for his decision. So that is the plan as of right now. That was what I was told last night. So I want to get to a few more here. Here we go. Here's the receiver question. Couple of receiver questions here as we get close to wrapping things up, Ryan. Brandon Plesner says, I feel like we have a good chance to land James, Tate, and Hannafin at receiver. A Gallagher, Greathouse, or Flores would just be an absolute cherry on top, although Gallagher is the most important in my opinion. So Ronan Hannafin as a receiver is a really interesting one, Ryan, because we have only ever talked about him as a athlete, but he has to start somewhere.
Sure.
And I think as of right now, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I believe as of right now, he wants to start off as a receiver. And I know that Notre Dame would have zero problem allowing him to play receiver and giving him a legitimate chance to stick there. And part of that's because of where they are at linebacker. I think the fact that they have done so well recently with Mpemba and Ausbury, and the fact that they got Preston Zinter has made it even more of a, sure, you want to play offense? Cool. Because we think we are in a better place over here than we thought we were. So, yes, Hannafin, I think, for the purposes of where he would start off with, I think we do need to look at him as a receiver.
Yeah.
Is that fair? I mean, is that accurate from the conversations you've had with him and his people?
No, that's fair. That's very fair. I would say, as far as this question, I guess I would agree that those first three names would be the ones that I feel best about currently. Like how things are trending with Rodney Gallagher and Jaden Greathouse, but certainly they look like they're in a great position for Braylon James. They look like they're in a good spot for Cardinal Tate, obviously fighting with Ohio State. Ronan Hannafin, I feel like they're in a good spot, even though his offer list has been, obviously increasing over the last few weeks.
I'd say.
Yeah, but I still think they're in the trouble with that one, Brandon, in my opinion, though, with that trio right there, is that they're all three, like, they're ideally outside receivers, right? So you don't really have a guy that projects incredibly well as a slot receiver. That's why I think it's paramount. If you did get those three, you have to get a Rodney Gallagher. Or I even think, and I know Brian's probably going to push back a little bit on it, I think that Jaden Greathouse could also play slot. So that would be
not at all. Because it's how I see, because I am with you, Ryan, because I think a lot of people view a slot as a shifty or right. I don't think a slot has to be that. Notre Dame was recruiting CJ Williams as a slot. I think it depends on how you, now if you used him and you're throwing him bubble screens and you're running screens all day, he's not a slot. But in a pro style offense, Ryan, a slot can be a physical kid that's a great route runner, that can work the middle of the field, that can get open. 100% agree with you. I think he can be a slot. I don't know if that would be where I would start him per se, but if that's where he fits best, no problem with that. So no, in Notre Dame's offense, I wouldn't push back on that at all. Now, in other offenses, in Clemson's offense, I would say no, he's not a slot. But Clemson runs a traditional college spread. Notre Dame is a pro-style pass attack. So no, we are on the same page in regards to his potential to be a slot. No doubt.
Yeah, and I think that in this scenario, again, like I say that to illustrate the fact that you need a guy that can project favorably into the slot. Like Cardinal Tate could play in there if you need him to. Braylon James maybe. I mean, like all three of those guys can play a little bit in the slot, but they're not true slot players, right? So you need to either get a Rodney Gallagher, you need a Jaden Greathouse to make that a elite wide receiver group. Like you need one of those guys,
right? Look at the bots are in full effect today for some crazy reason. So we just got hammered with them, but we will try to fix that. Here we go. I'm going to come back to this question here in a minute when Ryan gets back. Get to a couple here that we go. Let's see here. Here's an interesting one that I can address without Ryan being here. It says, Taylor Sharp says, do you think Notre Dame made a panic hire with Freeman since Kelly left last minute? Wanted to get everyone's thoughts. Absolutely not. And the thing that you have to understand is that when Marcus Freeman was hired by Notre Dame, he was a guy that Jack Swarbrick had his eye on as a potential next guy in line. I think the reason that Jack Swarbrick took some time to move on to Marcus Freeman is because that's just who Jack Freeman is. He does not make, when it comes to hires, he does not make like quick, irrational hires. He's always going to be thoughtful. He's always going to see what else is out there. And I think that's smart. You know, if Nick Saban calls and says, hey, I want to come coach Notre Dame, well, I'm sorry, I've got this guy that's never coached before. I mean, you may have to take that call and at least see what's going on. But he always thought that Marcus Freeman was that guy. I think the other part of the reason it maybe took a little bit longer is because the expectation when he came was that he'd be here a couple years, because Marcus Freeman had told Notre Dame he was going to be here 2 years, like at least 2 years. He had kind of given that verbal commitment. And if you know Marcus Freeman at all, he's a man of his word. Now, that was with the assumption that Brian Kelly was going to stay. Once Brian Kelly left, Marcus Freeman was no longer held to that because he would have been working under somebody else. He was not going to come back. But if Brian Kelly had stayed, Marcus Freeman would have stayed for another year. Jack Swarbrick knew that Brian Kelly's time was coming to an end and thinking it would be in 2 to 3 years, and Marcus Freeman being that guy to replace him. So I think Marcus Freeman always had an opportunity, if he proved himself at Notre Dame, to be that replacement. I think that was part of the reason that Jack Swarbrick was so willing to open up the checkbook to get him here in the first place. So I don't think anything about it was a panic hire. I think it took some thought. If anything, they took more time than I thought they should have. I thought it should have been a decision that was made quickly, and yet Jack Swarbrick reached out to several people. He interviewed Luke Fickell. I've been told that with 99.9% certainty that Jack Swarbrick and Luke Fickell had a face-to-face meeting about the head coaching job. I know that he talked to Matt Campbell. I could say it now. I'm pretty confident that he had conversations with Dave Clawson, was a guy that they had a conversation with. There wasn't really a ton of interest on either side, to be honest with you, but there was at least that conversation. Like, he did his due diligence reaching out to people. So that is the exact opposite, in my opinion, of a panic hire. And I think what it also shows is there were several coaches that would have taken this job if offered it, but he wasn't. I mean, it was always going to be Freeman. That's why if you're new to this channel, you don't know this, but if you go back to during that process, there was a lot of national people talking about Luke Fickell being the guy. And what we said at Irish Breakdown on our board and on this channel was, that's not what my sources are telling me. My sources told me from day one that they thought Freeman was going to be the guy, that's who they thought Jack was going to want, and someone else was going to have to blow Jack away in order for it not to be Marcus. And so when Coach had his second meeting with Jack, what I was told is going into that meeting, it wasn't really, he wasn't quite sure if it was like, okay, are we going to do it now? Or am I going to go for a second interview with Luke Fickell or a second interview with Matt Campbell, or maybe keep it open? But when it wasn't, so they had a second meeting is what I mean. They had the first kind of initial informal conversation right after Kelly left. That was the first conversation. So it wasn't a meeting. It was a first conversation. The second meeting was the formal interview that Jack had with Marcus. I was told going into that meeting that even though Marcus was the leader and the guy that was kind of always going to get the job, that Jack wasn't necessarily in I'm going to decide now mode. But about halfway through that meeting, it was like, why are we wasting our time with anyone else? This is my guy. So, Taylor, to answer your question, I don't think it. Now, we'll find out in 3 to 4 years if it was the right hire. I think it will be, but we'll find out. But in no way was it a panic hire. And I think those things are clearly different. A panic hire is, oh gosh, you rush into a decision and you make one. That's not what this process was about. Because again, Jack Swarbrick had already been planning for Brian Kelly leave. Look, Jack Swarbrick knew halfway through the year that Brian Kelly had checked out. Believe me. Jack Swarbrick had conversations with people before the season ended. Jack Swarbrick wasn't completely blindsided by Brian Kelly leaving. I think going to LSU the time that he did was surprising. They weren't prepared for the timing of it. But Jack Swarbrick was not completely caught off guard by the fact that Brian Kelly wanted to leave, right? And Kenny Moore makes a great point here. LSU made a panic hire. And I have said that before, Kenny, and I think you are spot on. I think LSU panicked because they lost Billy Napier had already said no. Mel Tucker had already said no. They thought they were getting Lincoln Riley. He goes to USC, and you're looking at the list of available candidates, and it wasn't a super impressive list. And I think, man, I think that was one where I felt like absolutely was a panic hire, and it absolutely was. So I think, Kenny, I think you were spot on about that. All right, John Kleinmick with a super chat. He says, can you talk about how having past players come back helps with recruiting and why BK supposedly did not like having them there? Was it his me complex? I mean, look, we've talked about this so much. Basically, Brian Kelly just didn't embrace the tradition of Notre Dame. Brian Kelly thought him and his staff were like, especially him, was like, this is how I want the program to be. And it wasn't, he didn't really embrace the past the way that I think he should have. And whenever he did, it was always in a self-serving manner. You know, it's like there was a event he had very early in his career with Coach Parsegian and Coach Holtz, which was a very, sort of a situation where it was kind of like it was a media event, right? It was a that's all it was. And it was always that if he ever embraced former players, it was always in a way that was sort of just for his own self-serving needs. That's just who he was. But I think there was other practical reasons in his mind why he didn't do it. But how it helps a ton because, number one, like it's kind of like why players like hearing from current players. Coaches can tell you all you want, but you get around the players and the players are going to tell you how it really is. And it's like I can say to you, hey, look, here's all the opportunities that Notre Dame prepares for you for life after football. That sounds great. Every school says that. Like, if you noticed, ever since Notre Dame kind of started the 4 for 40 thing, like really made it popular. I don't know if they were the first one to do it, but they were the ones that really sold it and made it popular, which is a really good pitch. Now, all of a sudden, you hear everybody talk about that, right? So there's clearly value to discussion. Everybody talks about it, but can you live it? Well, what's the best way to show kids that this 4 for 40 is a real thing? It's to meet players that have lived it. It's to meet the Todd Lights and see, like, yeah, I was a national champion. I was a top 10 NFL draft pick. I think top 5 NFL draft pick. I won a Super Bowl. I played in the NFL for over a decade. I made lots of money playing football. But, my degree at Notre Dame, what I learned at Notre Dame allowed me to then take that money and invest it in this way. And so now, even though I haven't been playing football for so long, I actually have more money now than I did when I retired because I've been able to use my opportunities to through different business ventures to go have a level of success. A guy like Jerome Bettis can talk about how the opportunities have opened up for him and why he's coming back as an alum to finish up his degree. And I thought his comment yesterday was the best part of the press conference about the Tennessee State game. Was talking about as a soon-to-be alum. This is Jerome Bettis, who got done playing football at Notre Dame in 1992, talking about how he's assumed to be alum. I thought that was pretty cool. But, it's these guys can live it. Like, they can say, look, man, here's what it was like, and it was tough, and it was this, and it was that, but it was so worth it to go through all those things because this is what it's done for me now as I'm an adult. And a lot of kids really want to see that stuff. And that's going to be the key. That's absolutely going to be the key to this whole conversation, really. A couple other things here we got from Tyler Bedwell. Tyler says, watching Ronan Hannafin's film, he is the type of kid who you ask him what position he wants to play and you let him play it. Pure athlete who makes plays. Tyler, I agree. I agree like 95% of your comment. And the only 5% I don't agree with is a 5% we don't know about now. I think there comes a time where you could look at your class and say, yeah, I know you want to play this, but we're so good there and we have needs here that we need to have an honest conversation with you about this. And I think that's especially needed in today's era where kids can leave after 1 year. You've got to be honest with kids. And so I think when you look at it now, I think it's a scenario in which right now, today, and where I think the class is going to go, 100% let Ronan Hannafin pick where he wants to play. 100%. But I think moving forward, there's a chance that could change based on things that we don't know about. And so I would expect it to stay the same, and I expect myself to agree with you. All I'm saying is I think you just have to leave yourself the out of if things change down the road. But right now, man, I agree with you completely, Tyler, that I'm going to allow him to play wherever the heck he wants to play. And John A1 asks, how much better is Hannafin at wide receiver compared to Nolan Ziegler? Well, much better. Like, Nolan was a really good high school receiver, but Nolan wasn't a guy that was going to come to college and play that position. He just wasn't. He wasn't a guy that necessarily would look at it and say, hey, could you play receiver in college? No, he just like he couldn't play safety in college. He was a linebacker. Now, he was a great high school player at receiver, just like Prince Collie was as a 1,900-yard running back. Nolan always projected as a defender. He didn't have like Nolan's an explosive athlete, but Ronan's kind of fluid. He's kind of smooth. I think he has a chance to be a really competitive guy in regards to being a good route runner. He has got a chance to be a guy that has really good ball skills. He has some natural receiver tendencies, whereas Nolan was just an athlete that could thrive in high school because he was an athlete. And so I think those are the differences between the two. I think one guy is a little bit more practical. And so I think this is an LSU fan. He says, so wait, if we're all glad that Kelly is gone, why do some of you hate LSU? None of us hate LSU as far as I know. We hate when LSU fans come in here and act like idiots. That's what we hate, just like we do with every other fan. We have an Alabama fan. We haven't seen him in a while. Ladarius Martin always comes in here, talks about Bama. It's always respectful. We're going to kick out LSU people that act like idiots. It's as simple as that. So, Mark, you're still posting because so far you haven't done that. And if you're an LSU fan and you want to come in here and have a conversation with us, talk to us, push back on things that we might say about Brian Kelly, you want to come in here and say, hey, here's why I think you're wrong, Brian Kelly, we'll allow that. Absolutely will allow that. You start saying stupid things and, talking about Rudy as if that's relevant or making some other comment, then sure, we're not going to allow that. But we are always going to allow that. We had a Michigan fan on here recently. So if we're going to allow a Michigan fan to be on here, then we'll absolutely allow a LSU fan to be on here. Matter of fact, before Brian Kelly took over, I kind of liked rooting for LSU. I think the 2019 LSU team we've talked about this on this show recently. It's one of the best teams I've ever seen. Certainly the best offense I've ever seen in my lifetime. And if you compare it to like the 2008 Oklahoma offense, because LSU could also score in the postseason. So don't come at us with that kind of stuff, Mark. That's petty and juvenile. Nobody here hates LSU. I can't stand people that say because you criticize someone, you hate them. That's petty and childish. I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm telling you, we don't hate LSU. We hate fans of any group that come here and act like idiots. And as long as you don't do that, Mark, you will always be welcome. Always be welcome. And now Mark has acted like an idiot, and now Mark is going to be gone. I gave you a shot, Mark. I gave you a shot, and you had to act like a 12-year-old idiot. And so now you're gone, and so no more Mark. I'll tell you, the next LSU fan that comes in here and acts like an adult will be the first LSU fan that comes in here and acts like an adult. Goodness gracious. Which I guess makes them fit really well with Brian Kelly. So there you go. So here we go. Here we go. Let me see if we got any questions here. Here's a comment from Jeff Hunt. In the last 5 years, Notre Dame has had 4 receivers drafted to Ohio State's 3. And in the last 10 years, Notre Dame has had 8 receivers to Ohio State's 9, one of them being Braxton Miller, who was a quarterback. Number one, real quick on that, Jeff, Ohio State moved Braxton Miller to receiver before his career ended at Ohio State. So he was not a quarterback in the sense that he was still playing quarterback, like, say, Keenan Reynolds or, Tracy McSorley was a guy that the teams had talked about wanting to move. So I don't think that's necessarily accurate, but I also think that you're not really looking at it from the standpoint of the way that I think you should. So the reality is that number one, in the last 5 years, so that's 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, if you're going to look at receivers, Ohio State has had 4 receivers drafted. Okay, so they had Curtis Samuel, they had Terry McLaurin, they had Paris Campbell, and they had KJ Hill. That's 4. Okay, now some of those guys weren't super high, right? Paris Campbell was 2, Terry McLaurin was a 2. None of those guys have been first-round picks, but again, 5. They've had 5 receivers in the last 5 years. I miss Noah Brown. So Braxton Thomas or Braxton Miller was part of that last 10. If you go back the last 6 classes, you got to remember, this is also a school that has produced Michael Thomas and Braxton Miller, Devin Smith, right? So the reality is Ohio State has produced a lot of receivers, and there's been more consistency to it. The reason Ohio State hasn't produced a lot of receivers the last couple years is because all the receivers have come back, right? So the fact that Chris Olave didn't come out last year is why he wasn't drafted last year. So, I don't think that's really an accurate thing to say. You also have to look at high school kids don't care about Michael Floyd being picked or even really Golden Tate. They don't know who those guys are. They're going to look at recent history, right? And from Will Fuller on, Notre Dame's done some good things as a receiver, but we can't really sit here and honestly contend that Notre Dame can compete with Ohio State in regards to what it's done in producing receivers. We really can't do that. Number one, a lot of those receivers from Ohio State have actually been better in the pros, right? Miles Boykin hasn't done a thing in the pros. TJ Jones is okay. Will Fuller's never had a 1,000-yard season. Michael Thomas has led the NFL in receiving yards. I mean, catches a couple times. I mean, Terry McLaurin's been a really good player for Ohio. He's with Washington, right? So you have to be honest, not honest. I did not mean it to be honest. You have to be objective about it, in my opinion. And if you were being objective, you can't look at the last 5 years and argue that Notre Dame can compete with that, because you also are ignoring the fact of what's about to happen. And that is Notre Dame's best receiver is not going to get picked anywhere close to where Ohio State's top 2 receivers are. So, yes, I think Notre Dame's receiver production has been a little bit it's been underrated, but it also can't compete with that, especially when you look at what they've done while they are in college. So that's the key here. So I'm just going to get to this question, and if Ryan comes back, he comes back and he can address it. If he can't come back, said something come up, then he can address it at another time. Laker Irish asks, how would you rank the following: Braylon James, Jaden Greathouse, and Rodney Gallagher? For me, it's Braylon, Gallagher, Greathouse. I would be willing to bet, and we'll see how well I know Ryan. I'd be willing to bet that before Ryan speaks, I'd be willing to bet that Ryan would have Jaden Greathouse number 1 of that group, at least for right now. But for me, it's Braylon. See, and to me, Jaden Greathouse is an intriguing player because I've said before, he's the best high school player on the board for Notre Dame. I mean, if you just look at what he is today, if I'm putting together an all-star, Ryan, so I want to ask you a question. Yep. I spoke for you, and I want to see if I'm right. Okay. This is the question. And I said, I think that Ryan would probably put Jaden Greathouse number 1, but kind of diving into the reasons why is that Jaden Greathouse has got the highest floor of any receiver on the board. And to me, that includes Cardinal Tate. Because right now, he's about 25 pounds heavier than Cardinal Tate, at least.
At least, yeah.
And he's a very advanced player. Jaden Greathouse is going to go somewhere and play as a freshman. Like, he just is.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I combine floor and ceiling a little bit more, and that's where Jaden falls down for me. But the fact that we could be in a conversation about players that Notre Dame couldn't land, and Jaden Greathouse could arguably be the 4th guy, says a lot about the quality of the board. Yeah. I think he's a really good player. I just don't know how much better he's going to be than what he is now, which is still a pretty good player. So I would take him in a heartbeat. It's just, if I can only have 3, and my options are Cardinal Tate, Braylon James, Rodney Gallagher, and Jaden Greathouse, Jaden Greathouse is going to be the odd man out for me. And that's where I stand. So for me, it's Braden, Braylon, Rodney,
Mm-hmm.
and Jaden. What say you, Ryan?
My first would actually be Rodney Gallagher. I really like Rodney Gallagher a ton, man.
Interesting.
I think he's going to be dynamic. My number one would be Rodney out of this three. Second would be Jaden Greathouse. I really do love Jaden Greathouse. And then Braylon James would be the last. And I think also, Brian, what you just said, like if Jaden Greathouse is your fourth guy, if Braylon James is considered your fourth guy, then you're doing all right, man, because these are all top 100 type of receivers, in my opinion. So I like Braylon. Upside, absolutely. Jaden, for me, I think that I just have a little more of I believe a little more in the upside than you do, but I also agree. I think we 100% agree on what the floor is. And I think Rodney could be dynamite, man. Like he could be a dude.
So you said he's your one?
He'd be my one. Rodney be my one. Yep.
Interesting. Very interesting. So you'd have Braylon James your number 3.
Out of this list, yep.
That's the one guy we have the biggest disagreement on. We don't disagree a ton on Jaden. We don't disagree at all on Rodney Gallagher. The guy you and I continue to disagree on is Braylon James. That's the one we continue to. No, I don't think it's slightly. I think it's pretty significant because he's my clear number one of this group. Like clear number one of this group. Because again, I'm looking at who's going to have the best college career. Who's the guy that's going to be the biggest difference maker. And I think he's going to be really good. And I think especially he's transferring high schools.
Yeah.
So, we'll see if that improves the coaching he's going to receive. But he's that kind of kid that for me as a receivers coach, Ryan, I love kids like this because it's like what Harry Heastan was, who was it? No, it was Al Washington was talking about this the other day. They were asking about Jason Owen. He's like, I kind of like these raw kids because it's like there's less I have to, I don't remember the exact way he said it, but like there's less I have to kind of deprogram, right? And that's kind of how I always felt. Like if you got a kid that's just out there being an athlete, and this is going to be true of Rodney Gallagher as well. If a kid just hasn't played the game or the position or hasn't played at the level I need him to, then he has less bad habits I got to break. Where if you're not completely sold on how Jaden Greathouse run routes, you're gonna have a lot you're gonna have to break down first. So you're gonna have to kind of take him as is. And that's one of the things I love about Braylon is I just look at him and say, man, that kid hasn't come close to reaching his full potential. Like I have argued he is at the very least is tied for the highest ceiling at receiver in the class. And that's with Tyler Williams and Cardinal Tate. Like those three to me that's the discussion I'm going to have about who's going to have the highest ceiling. Rodney Gallagher is interesting, Ryan, because he's such a different kind of player. It's hard for me to put Rodney number 1 simply because there is so much projection needed to whether he's even going to be a receiver. The only time I've seen him catching a ball in a game is either as a defensive back, a punt returner, or a shotgun snap. Now, we've seen some camp highlights of him catching the ball, and he catches the ball well. But my stance on catching the ball without pads when you can't get hit. That's a different animal. So not that I would disagree with you about Rodney. That's where my hesitation comes from. But as an athlete, he is a must get for me as the receiver because he does bring that unique aspect to it. And here's the question I'm going to have for you, Ryan. We talked about Jaden grading out as a slot. What would you rather have at slot? A Jaden Greathouse or a Rodney Gallagher? Not necessarily the player, because you just said Rodney's your top guy. I'm talking about stylistically, just your opinion. It doesn't have to fit the Notre Dame offense, what you like as an offense.
It's a good question. I would probably still defer to Rodney just because I really like the ability that he has to manipulate space. Like I think that Jaden can manipulate space in the sense that he's a dynamite route runner and he understands where to sit down against zones and to work into space. But I think that Rodney just gives you a higher upside as a slot receiver. So I would probably defer to Rodney. And especially with how the game is going, and this is not even pertinent to Notre Dame as much. We've seen RPO just kind of continue to get even more emphasized around the league, around college football as well. Like that kid in the slot in a heavy RPO system, talking about Rodney Gallagher, like that's dynamite, man. Like he's going to create a lot of explosive plays. Jaden Greathouse is going to make a lot of plays because he has great hands and he's a really good route runner and he's a physical kid. But I don't know if he's going to make explosive plays at the next level. And I know Rodney Gallagher is going to make some explosive plays.
I personally feel like to have the best offense possible of what I like to do offensively, you have to have at least one guy that is a get the ball in his hands and just let him play kind of guy. I think you need one. And I think Rodney's that guy. So to me, if I had to choose between the two, that's another reason I would take Rodney. That's my personal preference. I don't think that necessarily has to be true in Notre Dame's offense, but even then, we saw last year, if you're going to be running RPOs and screens and stuff, you need a guy that can turn a 5-yard pass into a big play. Because some teams are saying, look, we're going to let you nickel and dime us all day because eventually we're going to break up a pass. We're going to shift our coverage and take that away, or we'll be able to make a mistake. But if you have a guy that, man, if we don't take that guy seriously, if we don't cheat out our slot or our nickel defender, and that guy catches the ball, he's going to make one guy miss and he's gone. We have to contend for that. It just adds an element to your offense that can be really, really hard to contend with. So I'm glad I tried to hold on to this question as long as possible. He's just not coming back. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So there's a Michigan fan joined the chat, and I think this would be a fun way to end the conversation because he had some things that I wanted to kind of to get with, and I want to find his other question. So just give me 1 second. He had a question about
is it
Notre
Antoine?
Dame, about Ohio State. So he had several different things, but I want to kind of get to this part of the question. So here's an interesting part of this Ohio State matchup that I'm really curious about, because I've had some very intriguing conversations about the future of Ohio State football. And this is what Rodney said, and I don't have it quite in the order because it stars in the order that I star them, not necessarily the order that they come. So I'm trying to look at the order of it. He said, so here goes, I'm a Michigan fan, so welcome, Antoine. As we said, we welcome all fan bases if they come with respect. So far, Antoine has definitely done that. I'm a Michigan fan. Do you think Notre Dame has a good enough running game to test Ohio State? I think if Notre Dame is able to run the ball, you may be able to expose them, especially with that new defense. Then he kind of started talking about that. And he goes, Ohio State has a very arrogant fan base. I'm glad we're able to kick their butts last year. Yes, Rodney or Antoine, we have all talked about that in this channel. Ohio State fans are super freaking annoying. But he kind of talked about, Ryan, he had another comment, and this is what he said. He said, Michigan exposed Ohio State last year. They're very soft ever since they got rid of Urban Meyer. Ryan Day's made them a passing team. They don't deal with them trenches too good. And this is something that I find very fascinating, and we're going to learn a lot about Ohio State this year.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't disagree with what he's saying.
I don't either.
They really wrote. I mean, look, it's like with Larry Coker. If you just look at Larry Coker's first 2-3 years as a head coach, this guy's pretty good. Or if you just look at the record, I don't think we definitely know yet what kind of head coach Ryan Day is going to be, because Ohio State runs the ball for good yards. But even then, it's like they're not a real, like they're big. They're kind of, it's like their line is just a bunch of big guys that just lean on people. They don't like blow people up. Defensively, I've never seen a team waste more 5-star players up front than Ohio State has the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the same team they were in many years. They have not had a good defense since Urban Meyer left. I mean,
right.
Well, the first year, right? 19 was Day's first year. That's the only year they've had, and that was with Jeff Hafley.
Yeah. But
I think again, we'll see what happens with Jim Knowles. That's part of the reason Jim Knowles was hired. But in game one, I mean, I've heard this made by Michigan fans before, and I've had this conversation, and we have seen this a couple times recently, where when Ohio State's played a team that's real physical, Alabama beat their butts in the trenches last year. The reason Clemson couldn't is because Clemson wasn't very good in the trenches last year in 2020. So Clemson's offensive line in 2020 was terrible. So they weren't going to beat up Ohio State. But Alabama if it's not for a couple of turnovers, that game's even less competitive than it was. And it wasn't competitive. So overall thoughts on this, Ryan? And he had another one, saying if Notre Dame has a good running game, they can beat them, and talk about like not emphasizing the pass game, all this kind of stuff. But this is something that I don't think enough Notre Dame fans that are petrified of that opening game are really talking enough about. And that is Ohio State has not been a good team in the trenches for a couple years now.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to start with Ryan Day conversation for a minute here. I've seen a lot of lists and I've actually had conversations with my friends in the past, like over the last couple of years, where a lot of people rank Ryan Day as like one of the top like 2 or 3 coaches in college football. And I pushed back against that a lot, man. Cause like, yes, he's a very good offensive coordinator. There's no doubt. Like he can call a good game. But to your point, Brian, I mean, can we give the guy a little bit of time? Like, can we see his guys in?
Sure.
Like, I mean, I don't know.
I think that's the issue that I think some people have, right? Because
Right.
he's now been here 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
and you start to see, okay, what trends are we seeing?
Right.
And I think that's the thing that people look at. Now, the reason I'm willing to say yes to your question, can we give him some time? Yes, is because you look at the moves he made this offseason.
Sure.
He didn't make moves that a coach that went 11-2 usually makes, which is I'm overhauling a lot of stuff. Completely overhauled his defensive staff. Got rid of, Urban Meyer's O-line coach. Brought in Justin Fry. Justin Fry is a believer in running the football. I mean, he was at BC. They did at UCLA. So I think Ryan Day recognizes that they were soft in the trenches.
Mm-hmm.
Is why he made the moves. Now, just because you recognize it, I mean, Lincoln Riley brought in Alex Grinch to make the Oklahoma defense really good, and it never really got really good. It wasn't terrible, but it was never really good. So it's one thing to know you need to do it, but do you have the chops to do it? But I do think Ryan Day recognizes that that's a problem.
That's fair.
But I think we've seen enough trends to say it's a legitimate question as to whether or not he can push the buttons to get them where they need to get to, in my opinion. And because of some of the things we've seen, because it's not always just about firing your O-line coach and all of a sudden you're better, because Stud was the same O-line coach Ohio State had when they were running for 250 yards a year.
Right.
Right. And so is it him or is it you? It's like, Matt Nagy fired Harry Hiestand because he thought it would be better. And, come to find out, Harry Hiestand was never the problem. Matt Nagy was.
Right.
Right. And so like last year, I mean, with Travion Henderson and with Mayan Williams averaging over 7 yards a carry, they still only averaged 180 yards per game last year.
Yeah, that's a philosophy thing, right? Because obviously they're not running the ball a ton. So, I mean, it's a great point, Antoine. I do subscribe to parts of what you're saying for sure. I mean, and it's a weird too, Brian, because you would assume, yes, there's like no tenacity with that offensive line, but they are large. So you would think like they would be better moving forward than working backwards, right? Like in reverse. But I think there's definitely been some underdevelopment on both offensive and defensive line recently. Like there has. I mean, we talked about Zach Harrison a ton. Zach Harrison's physical gifts are off the charts, but for whatever reason, he hasn't materialized over the last couple of years. Offensive line, Nicholas Petit-Frere didn't materialize as a great player.
He regressed every year.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't get any better. Thayer Mumford didn't get any better. Josh Myers was a good football player, obviously, who went in the second round to the Green Bay Packers. But even the right tackle, DeJuan Jones, is a really physically gifted player, but he hasn't really turned it on either. So I think there's been underdevelopment. I think it is a good sign, like you said, that Ryan Day recognizes that. He identifies that as a problem, and he made changes for sure. But I do think that there is something to be said that, like, hey, man, there is ways that you can take advantage of Ohio State. This isn't like this behemoth that everyone and I get it, but I do think Antoine makes a solid point that it might be a philosophy thing more than even just I don't know if it's like a individual, deficiencies from a player to player perspective, or if it's just the fact that Ryan Day likes to pass the football a lot, and that kind of puts you in some bad situations.
Because you find out what a coach is the deeper he gets into his tenure. And this is my point. If you look at the first year that Ryan Day was the head coach, they had J.K. Dobbins. They ran for 266 yards a game, 5.6 yards per carry. J.K. went over 2,000 yards. 2020 didn't dip that much. They went for 256 yards per game, right? And they only played 8 games against an all Big Ten schedule. So it's just kind of like they ran for a bunch of yards. Against Bama, they only went for 147. The only tough team they played all year, they only went for $147. And then you look at this year, Ryan, and it's down to 180. Now, 5.5 yards per carry compared to 5.63 in 2019 is not a hard – it's a minuscule difference. To have an 86-yard drop in yards per game, that is 100% about usage. 100% about usage. And so when I look at that and I'm like, you had Travion Henderson going for 6.8 a carry. You had Mayan Williams going for 7.1 a carry. Heck, Master Teague the last 2 years had a significantly better yards per carry average than Kyron Williams by like 0.2 of a yard. I mean, that's a decent difference. And yet you still only went for $180, which in today's game, 180 yards per game is not a ton of yards. I mean, it's ranked them last year 47th in college football. So that's the thing for me is, so we're going to learn a lot about what his true philosophy is this year. Because if they're going to get – and last year, Ryan was with an offensive line that returned, 4 starters? And you had a stud freshman back.
Yep.
I mean, so you can't be like, oh, it's because they lost Trey Sermon. No, it's not. With all due respect, Trey Sermon, they were fine at running back last year with Travion Henderson and Mayan Williams and Master Teague. So, and Marcus Crowley. So anyway, I think there's some merit to that. And I think you talked about the defensive line part too. The fact that Isaiah Foskey had more sacks combined than all of their 5-star defensive linemen is
crazy.
Yeah, and I would love to see Zach Harrison in a Notre Dame uniform because they would coach him up. I think that's the other part too is Larry Johnson just hasn't been that guy for a few years. And you wonder, like, he's getting older now. Like, he's like 70 now, and he's close to it, isn't he?
He's got to be right in that ballpark.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. Let's see here. Larry Johnson is 70. Yeah. I mean, so like he's getting up there. And sometimes you wonder, like, is it kind of past that point now? So it's gonna be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think that's the thing that we're just not, and we'll get more into this as we kind of get closer to the summer and we kind of dive into that game. But I think that's an interesting aspect to this. And then now you lose your 2 stud receivers and all that kind of stuff. Toe Jam said the Ohio State DC is the guy that put the Oklahoma State defense in place that beat us in the bowl game. Should that be of concern? No. Number one is because he didn't put that game in play. He didn't put that defense in place from the standpoint of preparing for the game, which is not what Toe Jam is saying. He built that defense over 4 years, but he wasn't there. So he didn't prep for Notre Dame the way that Notre Dame prepped for his defense, watching his film. Number one. And number two, and I've pointed this out before, if you go back and look at Jim Knowles when he took over Duke and Oklahoma State, he had Duke. Ryan, you and I have talked about this. Duke was a pretty good defense considering the kind of talent level you can normally get. Their secondaries especially had some really good college football players in it. He was part of what helped recruit, the Rumpf and Chris, Victor Dimukeje, right? Like he built a defense that allowed them to go out and recruit guys like that. They had some good football players, but his first year taking over, they gave up more yards and more points per game than they did the year before. Same thing happened at Oklahoma State. More yards and more points than they gave up the year before for the coach he replaced. He runs a really complex defense, and it takes time to learn it.
Yes, it does.
And so that's the thing for me. Like by November, maybe Ohio State's players figure it out. I have a hard time thinking that by that. And here's the other thing, Toe Jam. Remember what Notre Dame did to that defense? They passed for 500 yards in that game. You know what I mean? And Oklahoma State had a far better defense last year than Ohio State did. Far better. Now, I would argue, and I think you would too, they didn't have the NFL athletes that Ohio State has, but they had better football players. With all due respect, there's not a linebacker at Ohio State that's beating out Malcolm Rodriguez. Not a one.
Good player, yeah.
Now, maybe he's not the NFL prospect that some of those guys are, but, so I don't think the defense was the problem, especially when you look at Notre Dame's going to have a much better offensive line when it comes to running the football now than what they had in the bowl game. So, I mean, if Notre Dame faces the same exact defense they faced in the bowl game in Columbus, okay. I can dig that. So I can live with that. So anyway, Ryan, anything else to add to this conversation? I think that's all for the questions. I don't think we have any more.
No, I mean, like you said, if you want to see a Jim Knowles coach defense, it's your first game after the transition, right? Like Knowles is a very good defensive coach. There's no doubt about it. And he'll get Ohio State in a very good position. Like
if they're patient, right. If they're patient by year 2-3, I would say by the latest, because he'll have better players than he had at Duke and Oklahoma State. So they're going to be able to get away with things. I would argue by the middle of year 2 at the latest is when we'll really start to see that defense. And then going into year 3, so 2024, if he's still there and if he's willing to recruit, you'll really start to see that defense be really good.
Right.
But the reason Jeff Hafley was able to have success in 2019, I mean, immediate success, right, is because Jeff Hafley brought an NFL defense, but he also understood that it's about let's line up, let's make sure our kids know where to line up, let's be aggressive, let's turn them loose. It wasn't a super complex defense. And I think that's what worked for them in 2019. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's what I saw when I watched Ohio State in 2019 is like he's got some NFL stuff in there, but at the same time, it's a lot like Clark Lee was.
Simplistic.
They got to be able to run to the football. That's the most important thing. Fly to the football, teach them how to tackle, teach them how to line up, and then let the talent take over. Jeff Hafley did that.
Right.
Greg Schiano was trying to show everyone how smart he was. Kerry Coombs, as great of a DB coach as he may be, just isn't that guy as a coordinator. I mean, some guys are just meant to be assistant coaches. Sure. And Kerry Coombs is just one of those guys that's he's just a defensive assistant coach. He's not a coordinator. Jim Knowles will get that defense right. It's just like you said, Ryan. It's not going to be the opener. If Ohio State shuts Notre Dame down the opener, it's going to say a lot more about Notre Dame than it does about Ohio State, in my opinion.
Agree.
So, anyway, that's going to be it, everybody. A couple people too brought up about Oregon too. Oregon beat Ohio State up in the trenches last year.
They sure did.
The only reason that was even a competitive game was Oregon just didn't have horses to run with Ohio State's skill players. I mean, and that's my concern about Notre Dame. If we're being honest, that's the thing for me too. But I'll take Notre Dame's offensive line for what I think it's going to be over what Oregon's was last year, as good as Oregon's offensive line was. So, that's kind of where I'm at on that. So anyway, that's going to be it, everybody, for today's show. This was a fun show, man. This went a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I was not expecting it to be a 3-hour show, but man, we had a lot to talk about. So everybody, thanks for joining us today. Ryan, thank you for coming back and getting to those last couple questions. I thought that Ohio State thing was really interesting. I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that. So, because I know you've watched a ton of Ohio State film the last few years, kind of getting ready for the draft.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. So anyway, everybody have a great rest of your day. We'll have a lot more recruiting stuff coming up. I got about 2 or 3 stories that Ryan and Sean have sent me today that I got to go edit and publish and get on the site. And Ryan's going to get back on the horn and get to some more kids. As my man Mace AK always says, join the message board, smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, share the podcast. And if you are a part of the message board and you haven't gone on today, we got some Dante Moore scoop on there. And if you're not on the message board and you want to hear the Dante Moore scoop, sign up for the message board and you're going to be able to find out. So anyway, all right, everybody, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining the Irish Breakdown Podcast.